Hello everyone. Welcome to Mr. Midnight True Crime Stories. I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep. So before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. Tonight, I want to take you back to a different San Francisco. Not the city you might know today, with its cable cars climbing steep hills as tourists snap photographs, or its famous fog rolling through the Golden Gate Bridge. No, tonight we're going somewhere quieter, somewhere lost. We're going to San Francisco in 1902, 4 years before the earthquake that would shake the city to its very foundations and reshape everything it once was. This is a San Francisco of gas lamps and horse-drawn carriages, of newspaper boys calling out headlines on street corners, of young women in long skirts and high collars stepping carefully along wooden sidewalks that could splinter if you weren't watching your step. It was a city growing so fast it could barely keep up with itself. Every day, new buildings rose from empty lots. Every week, new families arrived by train and by ship, chasing the promise of gold that had brought people here half a century before, or chasing something simpler, something we all understand. Work, opportunity, a chance to build something better than what they'd left behind. And in that rush, in that noise and ambition and constant forward motion, it was easy for people to slip through the cracks. Easy for someone to arrive and never quite be noticed. Easy for someone to disappear and leave barely a ripple behind. But this story isn't about someone who arrived. It's about someone who was already there. Someone who had every right to dream of a better future in this booming, bustling city. Someone whose disappearance would not go unnoticed, though the answers everyone sought would never quite come into focus. Let me tell you about Nora Fuller. She was 15 years old in January of 1902, though if you'd seen her walking down Market Street, you might have thought her older. Not because she looked particularly mature, but because she carried herself with a kind of quiet determination that didn't quite match her age. She had dark hair that she wore pinned up in the fashion of the day, and eyes that her mother would later describe as thoughtful. Always watching, always thinking. Nora wasn't a child anymore, not really. Not in the way we think of childhood today, with its long stretch of years before responsibility sets in. At 15, Nora Fuller was already working, already helping to support her family, already making decisions about her future that would have lasting consequences, though she couldn't have known how lasting, couldn't have imagined how brief her future would turn out to be. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me slow down. Let me take you back to the beginning, to before everything went wrong, to when Nora was just a girl with dreams and worries and a family that depended on her more than any 15-year-old should have to bear. Nora was born in China in 1886. Her father worked there, doing what exactly the records don't quite make clear, but he was American, and when Nora was still very young, he brought his family back to California. Back home, he might have said, though for Nora, America was as foreign as any place could be. She was a child of two worlds, born in one country and raised in another, and perhaps that gave her a kind of resilience, a kind of adaptability that would serve her well in the years to come. Or perhaps it just made her lonely in ways she couldn't quite express. Her father disappeared at sea when Nora was 9 years old. Not disappeared in the mysterious sense, not the way Nora herself would later disappear, but vanished nonetheless. He worked on the ships that crossed the Pacific, those massive vessels carrying cargo and passengers between continents, and one day he simply didn't come back. Whether he drowned or jumped ship or died of disease in some foreign port, no one ever knew for certain. What mattered was that he was gone, and his absence left a hole in the family that no amount of time could quite fill. Nora's mother was left alone with 4 children to raise and no steady income to speak of. She did what she could, taking in washing, taking in sewing, doing whatever work came her way. But it wasn't enough. It was never quite enough. And eventually, she made a decision that must have cost her more than we can imagine. She divorced Nora's father, or rather, she divorced his memory, his absence, the legal ghost of him that still bound her to obligations she couldn't meet. It was a scandal, even in a city as rough and ready as San Francisco. Divorced women were whispered about, avoided, treated with a kind of suspicion that seems cruel now, but was simply the way things were then. But Nora's mother did it anyway, because she had to, because survival doesn't leave much room for worrying about what the neighbors think. Nora understood, even at 9 years old, even at 10 and 11 and 12. She understood that her mother was doing the best she could. She understood that money was tight and getting tighter. She understood that the family needed her help, needed her to grow up faster than she might have wanted to. So when she turned 15, Nora left school, just stopped going one day and started looking for work instead. It wasn't an unusual decision, not then. Plenty of children left school at that age or younger, trading books and lessons for factories and shops and domestic service. Education was a luxury, and the Fuller family couldn't afford luxuries. But Nora had dreams that went beyond just surviving, beyond just making enough money to help her mother pay the rent. She loved to sing. Her mother remembered that about her, remembered how Nora would hum while she worked, remembered how her voice would fill their small apartment with melodies that seemed to come from somewhere beyond their four cramped walls. Nora talked about becoming a performer, about singing in theaters, about standing on a stage and making people feel something beautiful. It was a big dream, maybe too big for a girl from a struggling family in a city that had thousands of other girls with the same dream. But it was her dream, and she held on to it even as she took whatever work she could find. And in January of 1902, she thought she'd found something perfect. A job that would pay well, that wouldn't be too demanding, that might even leave her with time and energy to pursue her singing. It was advertised in the newspaper, in the classified section where people posted all kinds of opportunities and offers. The ad was simple, straightforward, nothing that would raise any alarm bells in the mind of a 15-year-old girl looking for work. Young white girl to take care of baby. That was all it said, more or less. Just that simple request, that ordinary domestic position that thousands of young women took every year. A nursemaid, a nanny, someone to watch over a child while the parents were busy with other things. It seemed safe. It seemed respectable. It seemed like exactly the kind of work a girl like Nora Fuller should be doing. The ad instructed interested applicants to respond through the newspaper office, which wasn't unusual. In those days, before telephones were common in most homes, before email and text messages and all the instant communication we take for granted now, people used newspapers as intermediaries. You'd send a letter to the paper, addressed to a box number, and the paper would forward it to whoever had placed the ad. It gave both parties a layer of privacy, a layer of safety, or at least the illusion of safety. Nora responded. She must have written a careful letter, describing her qualifications, explaining that she was reliable and responsible and good with children. She must have checked the mail every day, waiting for a response, hoping this would be the opportunity that changed things for her family. And a response did come. A postal card, delivered to the Fuller home, signed by someone calling himself John Bennett. The card was brief, professional. It instructed Nora to meet him at the popular restaurant at 55 Geary Street on the evening of January 11th. They would discuss the position in detail. They would see if she was a good fit. Nora's mother later said she felt uneasy about the meeting, though she couldn't quite explain why. Maybe it was just the natural worry of a mother watching her daughter step out into the world. Maybe it was something more, some instinct that whispered this wasn't quite right. This wasn't quite safe. But Nora was 15, old enough to make her own decisions, old enough to be trusted with something as simple as meeting a potential employer in a public restaurant. Her mother let her go. On the evening of January 11th, 1902, Nora Fuller left her home. She carried the postal card with her, the one signed by John Bennett. She told her mother she'd be back later that evening, after the meeting, after she'd hopefully secured this position that would help ease their financial burden. She walked out into the cool San Francisco night, and she must have felt a mixture of nervousness and excitement, the way anyone feels before a job interview, before a meeting that might change the course of their life. And that's when everything we know for certain comes to an end, and everything we can only guess at begins. Sometime that evening, around 9 o'clock, a telephone call came to the Fuller home. In 1902, not many working-class families had telephones in their homes. The Fullers didn't. But someone called for Nora, and the message was relayed to her family. The caller said that Nora wanted her brother to know she was at 1500 Geary Street, and that everything was fine. 1500 Geary Street. The family wrote down the address, relieved to know where she was, relieved that she'd taken the time to let them know. But they didn't call her back, didn't go to check on her. Why would they? She was at a job interview, or maybe starting her first day of work. She was safe. Except she wasn't safe. She wasn't safe at all. Because 1500 Geary Street, When someone finally went to check weeks later, wasn't a house or an apartment or a restaurant. It was a vacant lot. An empty piece of land with nothing on it but dirt and weeds. There was no building at that address. There never had been. So where was Nora Fuller? Where did that phone call really come from? And more importantly, whose voice was on the other end of that line? The family didn't know something was wrong. Not right away. Nora was independent. She was working. She might have stayed overnight with her new employers if the job required it. A day passed. Then another. Then a week. And slowly, the worry began to build. Nora's mother started asking questions, started trying to trace her daughter's movements on that January 11th evening. She went to the popular restaurant at 55 Geary Street, asking if anyone remembered seeing a young woman meeting with a man calling himself John Bennett. The restaurant staff were sympathetic but couldn't help. They served hundreds of customers every day. One young woman, one man, one meeting weeks ago. It was impossible to remember, impossible to trace. Nora's mother went to the police. She filed a missing person report, gave them all the details she could. The postal card, the advertisement, the phone call, the address that didn't exist. The police took notes, promised to investigate, but missing persons cases were common in a city of San Francisco's size. Young women left home all the time, running off with boyfriends, seeking new lives, escaping family obligations. Most of them turned up eventually. Most of them were fine. But Nora Fuller wasn't fine. Nora Fuller wasn't anywhere her mother could find her. And as January turned into February, as the days grew longer and the first hints of spring started to color the California hills, somewhere in San Francisco, in a quiet house on a quiet street, Nora Fuller lay still and silent in a room that had been prepared specifically for her arrival, though she would never leave it alive. Let's sit with that for a moment. Let's think about what it means for someone to vanish in a city full of people. There's something particularly terrible about urban disappearances, about the way a person can be lost in plain sight, surrounded by thousands of others who simply don't notice, who are too busy with their own lives to see that someone is missing, someone is in danger, someone needs help. 3 days before Nora Fuller left her home on that January evening, before she walked out into the night carrying hope and a postal card, a man walked into the offices of a real estate agent on Sutter Street. He was looking to rent a house, he explained. Something modest, nothing too expensive, just a place to stay for a short while. The agent showed him several properties, and eventually they arrived at 2211 Sutter Street. It was a simple house, nothing remarkable about it. 2 stories, several rooms, the kind of residential property that filled entire neighborhoods in San Francisco at the turn of the century. It wasn't furnished. It didn't have gas connected for lighting or cooking. It was just an empty shell of a building, waiting for someone to turn it into a home. The man said it would do perfectly. He signed the lease right there, paid 1 month's rent in advance, and gave his name as C.B. Hawkins. The agent asked for references, the way landlords did then and still do now, wanting some assurance that this stranger would pay his rent on time, wouldn't cause trouble, wouldn't disappear leaving damage and unpaid bills behind. C.B. Hawkins said he was staying at the Golden West Hotel and could provide references from there. The agent, satisfied with this answer, handed over the keys. It was January 8th, 1902, 3 days before Nora Fuller would vanish. 3 days before a young woman would walk out of her home and into a carefully laid trap. But the agent at the Golden West Hotel would later say they had no record of anyone named C.B. Hawkins ever staying there. No record at all. C.B. Hawkins didn't move into 2211 Sutter Street the way a normal tenant would move in. He didn't bring trunks of clothes or boxes of books or dishes or any of the ordinary possessions that make a house into a home. Instead, he went shopping. He bought a bed frame and a mattress, the cheapest he could find at a second-hand furniture store. He bought sheets and pillowcases, plain white ones, nothing fancy. He bought 2 pillows. And then, instead of having these items delivered during normal business hours, the way any ordinary person would, he insisted they be delivered at night. The furniture dealer must have thought it odd, but odd wasn't the same as suspicious. People had their reasons for wanting things done at unusual hours. Maybe Hawkins worked during the day. Maybe he wanted to be there when the furniture arrived to make sure it was handled carefully. The dealer agreed, delivered the items after dark to the house on Sutter Street, collected his payment, and left without thinking much more about it. But Hawkins did something else. Something that would later seem significant, though at the time it must have appeared meaningless. He took a pen or pencil and wrote his initials on the mattress. C.B.H. 3 letters in careful script, marking this object as his, claiming ownership in a way that seemed both ordinary and somehow deliberate, as if he knew these initials might matter later, might need to be traced, might become evidence. The house at 2211 Sutter Street remained dark. No gas was connected, so there were no lights burning in the windows at night. No one was cooking meals in the kitchen or warming themselves by a fire. The neighbors, if they noticed anything at all, might have assumed the new tenant worked long hours, came home late, left early. In a city where everyone was busy trying to make ends meet, where minding your own business was considered a virtue, a dark house wasn't cause for concern. It was just waiting, empty and quiet and waiting. And on the evening of January 11th, it stopped waiting. On that evening, Nora Fuller disappeared from her family's home, disappeared from the streets of San Francisco, and somehow ended up at 2211 Sutter Street. How she got there, we can only guess. Whether she went willingly or was forced, whether she knew the person she was meeting or thought she was still looking for John Bennett and a job caring for a baby. All of that is lost to time and silence. What we know is that she was there. And what we know is that sometime within 24 hours of her disappearance, Nora Fuller died in that back bedroom on the 2nd floor, in that bed with the initials C.B.H. marked on the mattress, in that house that was never meant to be a home, but only a place for something terrible to happen. Let me slow down here. Let me take a breath, and let you take a breath, because this is where the story gets heavy. This is where we have to acknowledge that we're not just talking about a mystery or a puzzle to be solved. We're talking about a young woman who died afraid and alone, who suffered in her final moments in ways I won't describe in detail, because you don't need those images in your head as you're trying to fall asleep, and because Nora Fuller deserves better than to be remembered only for how she died. But I need you to understand what happened next, because what happened next shaped everything. It shaped how the case was investigated, how it was reported, how it was remembered. It shaped the lives of everyone who got caught up in the search for answers. And it shaped the absence of answers that still haunts this story more than a century later. The man calling himself C.B. Hawkins, whoever he really was, left 2211 Sutter Street after Nora died. He left quietly, without telling the landlord, without settling his affairs. The rent came due in early February, and when it wasn't paid, the landlord sent someone to check on the property. This was normal procedure. Tenants sometimes skipped out owing rent. You had to follow up, see if they'd just forgotten or if they'd actually abandoned the place. On February 8th, 1902, 28 days after Nora Fuller vanished, a landlord's agent used a passkey to enter 2211 Sutter Street. The house was dark, all the shades pulled down tight against the windows. He walked through the empty rooms, noting the lack of furniture, the lack of any signs that anyone had really lived there. And then he climbed the stairs to the 2nd floor and entered the back bedroom. The shade was drawn in that room too, leaving it in near total darkness. But enough light filtered through that he could see the bed against the wall, could see the shape of someone lying there, covered by a sheet, lying so still they might have been asleep except for the quality of the stillness, the absolute absence of breath or movement. He raised the shade. Light flooded the room, and he saw Nora Fuller lying there, her body arranged almost carefully, as if someone had posed her, as if someone had wanted her to look peaceful even though nothing about her death had been peaceful at all. The agent ran. He ran from that room, from that house, ran to find the nearest police officer. Within an hour, the house on Sutter Street was swarming with investigators, with a coroner, with all the official machinery of justice trying to understand what had happened here, trying to piece together the story of this young woman's death. The coroner's examination revealed what you might already have guessed. Nora had been strangled. There were marks on her neck, bruises that told the story of hands pressing down, cutting off her air, holding her until she stopped struggling. There were other injuries too, evidence of assault, evidence of violation that the newspapers of the day would describe in veiled, euphemistic language, but that we can understand clearly enough. This wasn't just murder. This was a crime of violence and control and cruelty. And there were small details, strange details that didn't quite fit together. An apple in her stomach, partially digested, suggesting she'd eaten not long before she died. traces of alcohol in her system, though whether she'd drunk willingly or been forced, whether she'd been trying to calm her nerves before a job interview or been given something to make her more compliant, there was no way to know. A whiskey bottle found in the room, a cigar, but things that suggested someone had been there with her, had perhaps been drinking and smoking while she lay dying or dead. Her clothes were folded neatly nearby, not torn or scattered the way you'd expect if there had been a violent struggle. Did that mean she'd undressed willingly? Did it mean she'd known the person she was with, trusted them enough to let her guard down? Or did it mean something else entirely, something we can't quite understand from this distance in time? The police worked quickly to identify the body. They brought Nora's mother to the morgue, asked her to look at the face of the young woman found at Sutter Street. Can you imagine that moment? Can you imagine what it must have been like for Nora's mother to stand in that cold room, to see her daughter lying there, to have her worst fears confirmed in the most terrible way possible? She identified Nora. Of course she did. A mother knows her own child. And then she had to go home, had to tell Nora's siblings, had to somehow continue living in a world where her 15-year-old daughter had been murdered by a stranger, left alone in an empty house for weeks while the city went about its business all around her. The newspapers, meanwhile, went into a frenzy. This was exactly the kind of story that sold papers in 1902. A young woman, an innocent girl from a respectable family, lured to her death by a mysterious stranger who had planned everything so carefully. The public was outraged. They demanded justice. They demanded that the police find whoever had done this and make them pay. And the police, feeling the pressure, began to investigate with an intensity that was both admirable and troubling. They followed every lead, interviewed hundreds of people, built a case based on handwriting analysis and witness testimony and circumstantial evidence. But they also, in their eagerness to solve the case, made mistakes. They accused innocent men publicly, destroying reputations based on nothing more than suspicion. They let the newspapers print names before charges were filed, before evidence was solid, before anyone had been convicted of anything. It was justice in the age of yellow journalism, when selling papers mattered more than protecting the innocent, when the presumption of innocence was a nice theory, but not something that actually protected you if the press decided you looked guilty. But I'm getting ahead of the story again. Let me slow down. Let me take you back to those early days of the investigation, when the police were trying to understand who Nora Fuller had been meeting, who had rented that house, who had called her family to give them a false address. They started with the advertisement, the one seeking a young white girl to care for a baby. They tracked it back to the newspaper office, found the records of who had placed it. The ad had been placed by someone calling themselves John Bennett, but John Bennett had used a mail drop at the newspaper. He'd never come in personally. He'd never given a real address or any way to trace him beyond that box number at the paper. Dead end. They looked at the lease for 2211 Sutter Street, signed by C.B. Hawkins. They examined the handwriting, compared it to other documents, tried to find some way to identify this man who had rented a house under a false name, furnished it with just enough to serve his purpose, and then disappeared after Nora's death. And this is where the story gets interesting in a different way, because the police found something. They found a handwriting expert, a man named Theodore Kitka who had made a career out of analyzing penmanship, comparing loops and curves and pressure points to determine if two samples came from the same hand. And Kitka, after examining the John Bennett advertisement and the C.B. Hawkins lease, said they matched. The same person had written both. John Bennett and C.B. Hawkins were the same man, which meant the job advertisement had been a lie from the start. There was no baby to care for. There was no legitimate position. It had all been a trap, carefully set, waiting for someone like Nora Fuller to respond. Kitka didn't stop there. He examined 32,000 change of address forms filed with the San Francisco Post Office, looking for handwriting that matched the Bennett-Hawkins samples. 32,000. Can you imagine the hours of work that must have taken? The careful comparison of one sample after another, looking for similarities, looking for the distinctive patterns that would identify a single person among thousands. He found one near match, a change of address form filed in Kansas City. The police followed up, investigated, ruled it out. It wasn't the same person after all, just someone with similar handwriting, similar loops, and curves that meant nothing. But Kitka kept looking, and eventually, he found something that changed everything. There was a man working as a clerk at one of San Francisco's newspapers, and his name was Charles B. Hadley. He was in his early 30s, unmarried, living in a boarding house with a woman named Ollie Blasier who may or may not have been his romantic partner. The records are unclear on that point, the way records often are when it comes to the private arrangements of working-class people in the early 1900s. What matters is that Hadley was there, living his life, doing his job, until the Nora Fuller case exploded across the front pages of every newspaper in the city. And then, suddenly, Charles B. Hadley wasn't there anymore. He stopped coming to work. He didn't give notice, didn't explain where he was going, didn't settle his accounts. The newspaper discovered he was short in his finances, that he owed them money he couldn't pay. He simply vanished, the way people sometimes did in cities that were growing too fast to keep track of everyone. Cities where you could disappear into a new neighborhood, a new name, a new life without anyone asking too many questions. But the police were asking questions now. They were asking about every man who had disappeared around the time of Nora Fuller's murder. Every man who had shown even the slightest sign of suspicious behavior. And Charles B. Hadley, with his initials C.B.H., with his sudden departure, with his debts and his secrets, caught their attention. They brought his handwriting samples to Theodore Kitka. Letters Hadley had written, forms he'd filled out at work, anything with his penmanship on it. And Kitka compared them to the John Bennett advertisement, to the C.B. Hawkins lease, to those initials marked on the mattress in the murder room. He said they matched. Not just similar. Matched. The same hand had written all of them. The police began to build a case against a man who was no longer there to defend himself. They talked to people who had known Hadley, who had worked with him, who had lived near him. And a picture began to emerge, a portrait of a man who was, in the language of the time, degenerate, suspicious, dangerous. Ollie Blasier, the woman he'd lived with, told police about finding blood-stained clothes in their rooms shortly after Nora Fuller's disappearance. She said Hadley had insisted on burning them, had told her they were ruined and couldn't be salvaged. At the time, she hadn't thought much of it. Accidents happened. Clothes got stained. But now, looking back through the lens of suspicion, it seemed sinister. Why would a newspaper clerk have blood-stained clothes? Why would he be so insistent on destroying them? Other details emerged. Hadley had owned a false mustache, one of those cheap theatrical disguises that anyone could buy from a costume shop. He'd purchased it from a Japanese store in the city, and the shopkeeper remembered him because he'd been particular about the style, the color, the way it fit. Why would an ordinary newspaper clerk need a false mustache unless he was trying to disguise himself, trying to become someone else? And then there was the matter of his eating habits. Several people who knew Hadley mentioned, almost in passing, that he had particular tastes when it came to food. He would only eat the tenderloin portion of a porterhouse steak. Nothing else would do. He'd order it at restaurants, specify exactly which cut he wanted, refuse anything that didn't meet his standards. It seemed like an odd detail to fixate on, but it fit with other things people said about him. He was refined in his appearance. He dressed well, spoke well, carried himself with a certain sophistication that didn't quite match his salary or his station in life. And there was something else, something darker. Records showed that Charles Hadley had a history, not under that name, but under another one. His real name, it turned out, was Charlie Start, and he'd been wanted in Minneapolis on an embezzlement charge. He'd also been accused of assaulting a 15-year-old girl in another city, though the details of that case were murky and the outcome unclear. The accusation alone was enough to paint him as dangerous, as someone who might see a young woman like Nora Fuller not as a human being, but as something to be used and discarded. The police felt they had their man. They had the handwriting evidence, the suspicious behavior, the criminal history, the false identity, the blood-stained clothes. They had a suspect who had fled the city just as the investigation was heating up, who had left behind debts and questions, and a photograph that would become central to the case in ways that were both helpful and problematic. The photograph showed Charles Hadley as he'd appeared in better times, before everything fell apart. He was clean-shaven in the image, looking directly at the camera with an expression that was hard to read. Confident, maybe. Self-assured. But the police needed to know if this was the man who had met Nora Fuller, who had lured her to Sutter Street. And witnesses who saw him clean-shaven couldn't be certain. People's memories were unreliable. They'd seen someone briefly, weeks ago, in a crowded restaurant, or on a busy street. How could they be sure? So the police did something that seems almost comical now, but was considered cutting-edge detective work at the time. They altered Hadley's photograph, adding a brown mustache to match the false one he'd owned, the one he might have worn when posing as John Bennett or C.B. Hawkins. They showed this altered photograph to witnesses and asked if this was the man they'd seen. Some said yes. They recognized him. They were certain. He was the man who'd met Nora Fuller at the popular restaurant. He was the man who'd rented the house on Sutter Street. He was the killer, no question about it. But others weren't so sure. The owner of the popular restaurant looked at the photograph, studied it carefully, and said no. He didn't recognize this man. He couldn't say with any certainty that Hadley had ever been in his establishment. And that created a problem, because if Hadley hadn't met Nora at the restaurant, if the entire meeting described in the John Bennett postal card had never happened, then what did happen? Where did Nora go that night? Who did she meet? The investigation was running into complications, the way investigations always do when they rely too heavily on circumstantial evidence, on matching handwriting and suspicious behavior rather than hard proof, eyewitness accounts that can be verified, physical evidence that ties a specific person to a specific crime. But the public didn't care about complications. They wanted justice. They wanted someone arrested, tried, convicted, punished. And the newspapers, feeding on that hunger, kept printing stories about Charles B. Hadley, kept speculating about his guilt, kept building a narrative that made him into a monster even though he'd never been formally charged with anything. Meanwhile, Hadley himself remained missing. The police issued wanted circulars, spread his description across the country. They checked train stations and ship manifests, interviewed people in cities where he might have fled. They offered rewards for information, encouraged the public to report any sightings. But Charles B. Hadley had vanished as completely as Nora Fuller had, and unlike Nora, his body was never found. He was just gone, leaving behind only questions and suspicions and the ruins of a life he'd been living under a name that wasn't even his own. There's something particularly frustrating about suspects who disappear. It leaves everything unresolved, everything hanging in the air without closure. For Nora Fuller's mother, for her siblings, for everyone who loved her, the absence of an arrest meant the absence of justice. It meant their daughter's killer was still out there somewhere, walking free, breathing air, living a life he'd stolen from a 15-year-old girl who'd only wanted to help her family, who'd only been trying to find work in a city that promised opportunity, but delivered tragedy instead. Let's pause here for a moment. Let's think about Charles Hadley, or Charlie Start, or whoever he really was beneath the layers of false names and false mustaches. If he was the killer, and the evidence certainly suggests he might have been, what kind of person does something like this? What kind of mind plans out a murder with such care, rents a house specifically for the purpose, places an advertisement designed to lure a specific type of victim, and then executes the plan with such cold precision? Psychologists today might call him an organized offender, someone who fantasizes about violence, who plans carefully, who takes steps to avoid detection. They might talk about narcissism, about a need for control, about sexual deviance that escalates from fantasy to action. They might say he'd done this before, that you don't develop this level of planning without practice, without having refined your methods through previous crimes. But in 1902, psychology was still a new field. The concept of serial killers didn't exist yet, at least not in the way we understand it now. People who committed multiple murders were called fiends or monsters, but there was no systematic study of their behavior, no profiling, no understanding of patterns and motives. Charles Hadley was just a bad man who'd done a terrible thing, and the goal was to catch him and punish him, not to understand him. Except they didn't catch him, and that failure to catch him, that absence of closure, meant that other theories began to circulate. Because if Hadley was the killer, why did some witnesses not recognize him? Why did the restaurant owner, who should have seen John Bennett meeting with Nora Fuller, fail to identify Hadley's photograph even when it was altered to show a mustache? And if Hadley wasn't the killer, then who was? Who else had the opportunity, the motive, the means to commit this crime? That's where the story starts to fracture into possibilities, into theories that compete with each other, that offer different explanations for the same set of facts. And I want to walk through some of these theories with you, not because I can tell you which one is right, but because I think there's value in sitting with uncertainty, in acknowledging that sometimes we don't get the answers we want, Sometimes the truth remains just out of reach no matter how hard we search for it. One of the alternative theories that emerged centered on something that came out later in the investigation, something that Nora's friend Madge Graham revealed reluctantly, almost guiltily, as if she were betraying a confidence even though Nora was beyond being hurt by secrets now. Madge told police that Nora had been seeing someone. Not just casually, not just in passing, but regularly, secretly. An older man whose name Nora had never mentioned, whose identity remained mysterious. According to Madge, Nora had been going to theaters with this man, had been receiving phone calls from him at hotels where he'd arranged to meet her. She'd been secretive about it, knowing her mother wouldn't approve of a relationship with someone older, someone whose intentions might not be honorable. But she'd also seemed happy about it, or at least interested, as if this relationship represented something exciting, something adult, something that belonged to her alone. If Madge's account was true, and the police had no reason to doubt her, then it opened up an entirely different possibility. What if the John Bennett advertisement had never been real? What if Nora had placed the response herself, or had her secret boyfriend place it, as a cover story? What if she'd told her mother she was going to a job interview, when really she was meeting this mysterious man, running away with him, starting a new life? And what if something had gone terribly wrong? What if an elopement had turned into an argument into violence, violence into murder? What if the man Nora trusted, the man she'd been seeing in secret, had killed her either in a moment of rage or as part of a plan that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with darker impulses? This theory had a certain appeal. It explained why Nora might have gone willingly to Sutter Street, why she might have undressed without a struggle, why she might have eaten and perhaps drunk alcohol before her death. She'd been with someone she knew, someone she trusted, at least initially. The house might have been rented as a place for them to be together without judgment, without interference. And then something had shifted, had turned violent, had ended with her body left alone in that room for weeks. But if this theory was true, who was the man? Madge didn't know. She'd never met him, had never even seen him. She only knew what Nora had told her, and Nora had been careful to keep his identity secret. The police investigated, trying to find any evidence of this relationship, interviewing men who might have known Nora, checking hotel registers for names that might connect to her. But they found nothing concrete. If the secret boyfriend existed, he'd hidden his tracks well. Or perhaps he'd been Charles Hadley all along, and Nora had known her killer better than anyone realized. Another theory focused on the oddity of that phone call on the night Nora disappeared. Remember, someone had called the Fuller home claiming to be Nora, saying she was at 1500 Geary Street. But that address was a vacant lot. So who made that call? And why? If it was Nora herself, forced to make the call by whoever had taken her, then it suggested a level of planning and control that was chilling. The killer had wanted her family to think she was safe, had wanted to buy time before anyone started looking for her. Maybe he'd told her what to say, had stood there listening while she spoke, ready to hurt her if she tried to signal for help. Maybe the nervousness people heard in her voice wasn't about a new job, but about fear, about knowing she was in danger and being unable to communicate that to the people who loved her. Or maybe it wasn't Nora at all. Maybe someone else had made the call, someone who sounded enough like her to fool her family in the brief exchange, someone who was covering tracks, creating confusion, leading investigators down false paths. In 1902, telephone calls were still relatively uncommon, and the quality wasn't good. It was harder to identify voices with certainty. Someone who knew Nora's voice well enough to imitate it might have been able to pull off the deception, might have created the illusion that she was safe while she was already dead or dying. And then there was the question of those small, strange clues that didn't seem to fit any neat narrative. The fragment of a Denver Post newspaper found on the floor of the murder room. The police traced it through multiple hands, followed it back through the chain of people who might have had access to that particular edition, and ended up at a restaurant where the trail went cold. How had that newspaper fragment ended up at Sutter Street? Had the killer brought it there? Had it been in Nora's possession? Was it evidence of something, or just random debris, meaningless in the grand scheme of things? There was the card found in Nora's purse, the one with a name written on it. Mr. M.A. Severbrinick of Port Arthur. The police tracked down Severbrinick and discovered he'd sailed to China just 3 hours before Nora left her home on January 11th. 3 hours. He couldn't have been involved in her disappearance because he was already out at sea when she vanished. But why did Nora have his name in her purse? Had they met? Had someone given her the card? Was it connected to her father's work in China, to some business contact, to a completely innocent explanation that happened to coincide with terrible timing? These loose threads frustrated investigators then and frustrate us now. We want everything to fit together neatly, want every piece of evidence to point in the same direction. But real life isn't like that. Real life is messy and complicated. And sometimes a cigar, but is just a cigar, but a newspaper fragment is just trash. A name in a purse is just a coincidence. Or sometimes these things mean everything, and we just can't see the connections from where we're standing, this far away in time. The police continued to focus primarily on Charles Hadley because he remained their strongest suspect. Even without being able to arrest him, even without him being there to question or charge, he was the one who fit best. The handwriting evidence was compelling. The initials CBH matched his name. His disappearance at exactly the right time suggested guilt. His history of criminal behavior and assault suggested capability. The false mustache suggested deception. The bloodstained clothes suggested violence. But suggesting isn't the same as proving. And in the absence of Hadley himself, in the absence of a trial where evidence could be tested and witnesses cross-examined, all the police could do was continue searching for him, continue building their circumstantial case, continue hoping that somewhere, somehow, he'd make a mistake and reveal himself. The newspapers, meanwhile, continued their coverage with an intensity that was both impressive and disturbing. They printed every detail of the investigation, every theory, every wild speculation. They printed the names of men who had been questioned and released, men who had nothing to do with Nora's death, but whose reputations were destroyed anyway by the mere association with the case. They printed graphic details of her injuries, of the crime scene, details that we would consider inappropriate today, but that seemed perfectly acceptable in the sensational journalism of the early 1900s. And they printed stories about Nora herself, stories that tried to make sense of who she'd been. What kind of girl would respond to a newspaper advertisement? What kind of family would let their 15-year-old daughter go out alone at night to meet a stranger? There was a subtle victim blaming in some of these accounts, a suggestion that Nora or her mother should have been more careful, should have known better, should have somehow prevented what happened. As if a young woman looking for work in 1902 should have been able to predict that a simple job advertisement was actually a death trap. As if her mother, struggling to support 4 children alone, should have had the luxury of being overprotective when survival required taking risks. This was the uglier side of the case's publicity. The way it exposed not just a murder, but all the prejudices and assumptions of the time. The way it revealed how society viewed working-class girls, immigrant families, women who stepped outside the narrow boundaries of acceptable behavior. Nora became more than just a victim in these accounts. She became a cautionary tale, a warning to other young women about the dangers of ambition, independence, trusting strangers. But she was also a cause célèbre in other ways. Women's groups rallied around her memory, demanding better protections for working girls, better oversight of classified advertisements, better training for police in handling cases involving violence against women. They held memorials, raised money for her mother, pushed for reforms that might prevent future tragedies. In death, Nora Fuller became a symbol of all the young women trying to make their way in a city that was both full of opportunity and full of danger. Her mother, meanwhile, lived with a grief that never quite healed. She buried Nora in a cemetery in San Francisco, visited the grave regularly, kept hoping that somehow justice would be served, that the person who'd killed her daughter would be found and punished. But as months turned into years, as the investigation wound down and Charles Hadley remained unfound, that hope must have faded. Not disappeared entirely, because hope has a way of persisting even when logic says it shouldn't, but faded enough that getting through each day became a matter of accepting that some questions would never be answered, some wounds would never fully close. And then, in 1906, just 4 years after Nora's death, the earthquake hit. The massive San Francisco earthquake and the fires that followed reshaped the entire city. Buildings collapsed. Records were destroyed. The house at 2211 Sutter Street may have survived or may have been damaged or may have been torn down in the rebuilding. We don't know. So much of the physical evidence of that time was erased by the disaster. buried under rubble or consumed by flames. It's almost as if the city wanted to forget, wanted to move forward without carrying the weight of tragedies like Nora Fuller's murder. And in the rush to rebuild, to create a new San Francisco from the ruins of the old one, stories like Nora's Got Left Behind became historical footnotes, became mysteries for future generations to puzzle over without ever quite solving. But before we move too far past Charles Hadley, I want to spend some time thinking about what we know and what we can only speculate about when it comes to this man who may or may not have been a killer. Because even if we can't be certain of his guilt, there's something instructive in examining the case against him, in understanding how investigations worked in the early 1900s, how justice functioned or failed to function, how a man could become the prime suspect in a murder without ever facing trial. The handwriting analysis that connected Hadley to both the John Bennett advertisement and the C.B. Hawkins lease was, for its time, sophisticated forensic work. Theodore Kitka was one of the early practitioners of what would eventually become a recognized field of forensic science. He understood that handwriting was individual, that the way a person formed letters, the pressure they applied, the slant of their script, all of these things created a unique signature as distinctive as a fingerprint. But handwriting analysis has always been more art than science. Even today, with better tools and more rigorous standards, it's not infallible. And in 1902, without any standardized methodology, without peer review or challenge in court, Kitka's word was essentially taken as gospel. He said the handwriting matched, so the police believed the handwriting matched. There was no defense attorney questioning his methods, no opposing expert offering a different interpretation. Just Kitka's certainty, presented as fact. Still, let's assume for the moment that Kitka was right, that the handwriting truly did match. What does that tell us? It tells us that the same person who placed the advertisement seeking a young white girl also rented the house on Sutter Street under the name C.B. Hawkins. It tells us that this was planned, that someone set out deliberately to create a trap designed to lure a specific type of victim to a specific location. Charles Hadley's initials matched the initials on the lease and on the mattress. That's not conclusive evidence, of course. CBH could stand for any number of names. But combined with the handwriting match, combined with his disappearance, combined with all the other suspicious elements, it starts to form a picture that's hard to ignore. The false mustache is particularly interesting. People in 1902 used false facial hair for theatrical purposes, for costume parties, sometimes even to disguise themselves when they didn't want to be recognized. The fact that Hadley owned one doesn't prove anything criminal. But the fact that he bought it, that he had it in his possession during the time period when Nora Fuller was lured to her death, that creates a connection that's hard to dismiss as coincidence. If Hadley wore the false mustache while posing as John Bennett, while meeting Nora at the restaurant or luring her to Sutter Street, it would explain why some witnesses who saw the altered photograph recognized him while others didn't. A mustache changes the shape of a face, alters how someone appears. Witnesses who'd seen him with the mustache might recognize the altered photograph. Those who'd only known him clean-shaven might not see the connection. But here's where the case against Hadley runs into problems. If he wore a false mustache to disguise himself, why would he then rent the house under a name with his own initials? Why would he mark the mattress with those same initials? That seems almost deliberately careless, as if he wanted to leave a trail, wanted to be caught, wanted to claim credit for what he'd done. Serial killers sometimes do this. They take trophies, leave signatures, engage in behavior that seems designed to taunt investigators. But Hadley, if he was the killer, also took steps to avoid detection. He used false names. He disappeared at the right moment. He left no obvious physical evidence tying him directly to the crime. So was he clever or careless? Organized or disorganized? The evidence seems to point in both directions simultaneously. The bloodstained clothes that Ollie Blasier described add another layer to the case. She said she found them, that Hadley insisted on burning them, that this happened around the time of Nora's death. But we have to be careful here. We have to remember that Ollie came forward with this information after Hadley was already a suspect, after the newspapers had been printing his name and describing him as a probable killer. Memory is malleable, suggestible. What if she'd found blood-stained clothes at some other time, for some innocent reason, and her memory shifted the timing to fit the narrative she'd absorbed from the papers? Or what if she was simply lying? People lied to investigators all the time, for all sorts of reasons. Maybe she was angry at Hadley for leaving her, for disappearing without explanation. Maybe she wanted to help the police solve a high-profile case, wanted to be important, wanted to be the person who provided the crucial evidence. Maybe she genuinely believed what she was saying, but was wrong about the details in ways that made her testimony unreliable. This is the fundamental problem with building a case on circumstantial evidence and witness testimony, without the suspect present to defend himself. There's no opportunity to test the evidence, to cross-examine witnesses, to challenge assumptions. The police and the public simply decided that Hadley was guilty, and every piece of information that emerged was interpreted through that lens. Things that might have had innocent explanations became proof of guilt. Coincidences became conspiracies. A man who might have fled San Francisco for entirely unrelated reasons became a murderer fleeing justice. And yet there's the matter of his criminal history. Charles Hadley, also known as Charlie Start, had a record. He'd been wanted for embezzlement in Minneapolis. He'd been accused of assaulting a 15-year-old girl. These weren't just rumors or suspicions. These were documented accusations, legal proceedings that had happened before Nora Fuller was ever born. A man who had previously assaulted a 15-year-old girl, who had a documented history of criminal behavior and dishonesty, who then disappeared just as police were investigating the murder of another 15-year-old girl. That's not proof of murder, but it's certainly suggestive of a pattern, of someone whose moral boundaries were flexible at best, who saw young women as objects to be used rather than people to be respected. The detail about his eating habits, about only consuming the tenderloin portion of porterhouse steaks, might seem trivial, but it speaks to a kind of fastidiousness, a need for things to be exactly right according to his standards. And that fastidiousness might extend to other areas of his life, to planning a murder with precision, to staging a scene with care, to maintaining control even in the midst of violence. Some criminal psychologists would say that people who commit organized, premeditated murders often have these kinds of particular habits and preferences. They're not chaotic or impulsive. They're controlled, methodical, perhaps even obsessive. They plan carefully because planning gives them a sense of power, a sense of being in control of events rather than subject to them. If Charles Hadley was that kind of person, if he was someone who needed control and precision and things to be exactly as he wanted them, then Nora Fuller's murder fits a certain profile. The carefully rented house. The furniture delivered at night to avoid attention. The advertisement designed to lure a specific type of victim. The false identity, the false mustache. All the layers of deception designed to create distance between Charles Hadley, the newspaper clerk, and whoever committed the crime. But then why leave the initials? Why mark the mattress? Why create a connection that could be traced back to him? Unless the initials were meant for someone else, some other CBH who might take the fall if the police got close. Unless marking the mattress was part of the staging, part of creating a scene that would confuse investigators rather than enlighten them. Or maybe he just made a mistake. Maybe even organized killers slip up sometimes, leave evidence they didn't mean to leave, make errors in judgment that ultimately lead to their identification, if not their capture. We'll never know for certain because Charles Hadley was never caught, never questioned, never put on trial. He disappeared into the vast anonymous spaces of turn-of-the-century America, where a man with a new name and a little bit of luck could reinvent himself completely. He could have gone to another city, gotten another job, lived out the rest of his life without anyone knowing what he'd done in San Francisco. He could have committed other crimes, hurt other women, left a trail of victims across the country that was never connected because police departments didn't communicate well with each other, because there were no national databases, because a murderer who moved to a new city was essentially starting with a clean slate. Or he could have killed himself. That's another possibility that the police considered at the time. Maybe the guilt was too much. Maybe he knew he was about to be caught and decided to take control of his own fate the way he'd tried to control Nora's. Maybe his body was lying in some ravine or floating in some river, unidentified, unclaimed, decomposing into anonymity while his name was being spread across wanted posters throughout the country. Or maybe Charles Hadley had nothing to do with Nora Fuller's murder. Maybe the handwriting analysis was wrong. Maybe the coincidences were just coincidences. Maybe he fled San Francisco for reasons that had nothing to do with murder and everything to do with the embezzlement charges in Minneapolis, the debts he owed, the life he was tired of living. Maybe he's the most famous suspect in a case he didn't commit, a man whose name is forever linked to a crime he didn't do simply because he was in the wrong place at the wrong time and then made the mistake of running. This uncertainty, this inability to close the case definitively, must have been incredibly frustrating for investigators. They felt they had their man. They had evidence. They had witnesses. They had motive and means and opportunity. But without Hadley in custody, without a trial, without a conviction, none of it mattered. Nora Fuller's killer, whether it was Hadley or someone else entirely, remained free. Let me take you back now to the investigation in its earlier stages, before Hadley became the primary focus, when police were still casting a wide net and bringing in anyone who seemed even remotely suspicious. Because one of the most troubling aspects of the Nora Fuller case wasn't just what happened to Nora, or even the failure to catch her killer. It was what happened to innocent men who got caught up in the investigation. Men whose names were printed in newspapers alongside accusations they couldn't adequately answer. Men whose lives were permanently altered by suspicion even though they'd done nothing wrong. In the first weeks after Nora's body was discovered, police questioned dozens of men. Anyone who had been in the area of Sutter Street. Anyone who had rented property around that time. Anyone whose handwriting vaguely resembled the samples they had. Anyone who fit the general description of the man seen at the popular restaurant. The problem was that man of average height and build, possibly wearing a mustache, describes an enormous number of people in any major city. And the newspapers printed all of it. Every interrogation, every name, every speculation became front-page news. There was no presumption of innocence in the court of public opinion. If you were brought in for questioning in connection with the Nora Fuller case, your name would be in the paper the next day, and your neighbors would look at you differently. Your employer might let you go. Your family might face harassment. Some men lost their jobs simply because they'd been questioned. Some had their homes vandalized. Some received death threats from vigilantes who decided they knew who was guilty and didn't want to wait for the slow machinery of justice to grind through the process. This was mob mentality fed by sensational journalism, and it destroyed lives with a casual cruelty that should horrify us. There was a man, for instance, whose name appeared in several papers as a person of interest. He'd been in the area of Sutter Street. He'd been seen talking to a young woman who might or might not have been Nora. He couldn't provide a complete alibi for the relevant time period. The police brought him in, questioned him for hours, eventually released him because they had no actual evidence connecting him to the crime. But the damage was done. His name had been printed. The association had been made. People who saw him on the street whispered. His employer, nervous about the publicity, suggested he might want to seek employment elsewhere. His wife, stressed by the attention and the accusations, grew distant, unsure if she really knew the man she'd married. All because he'd been in the wrong place at a time when police were desperate to solve a high-profile case and newspapers were desperate for any development they could print. This happened over and over. Innocent men were swept up, examined, exposed, and then discarded when they didn't fit quite right. And each time, the newspapers dutifully reported every detail, creating a permanent public record of suspicion that followed these men for the rest of their lives. The restaurant owner who couldn't identify Hadley's photograph found himself questioned multiple times. If he didn't remember John Bennett meeting Nora Fuller at his restaurant, was it because it hadn't happened there? Or was it because he was protecting someone? Hiding something? The police seemed to suspect the latter, seemed to think that his failure to provide the identification they wanted must indicate guilt or complicity. But maybe he was just being honest. Maybe he served hundreds of customers a day and genuinely couldn't remember one particular meeting weeks after it happened. There were clerks at hotels who were questioned because they might have rented rooms to someone using a false name. There were furniture dealers who sold beds to anonymous customers. There were cab drivers who might have driven a young woman to Sutter Street. All of them were brought in. All of them were interrogated. And many of them found their names in the papers even though they'd done nothing more than conduct ordinary business transactions. This is one of the darker legacies of the Nora Fuller case. Not just that her murder went unsolved, but that the investigation itself became a kind of secondary tragedy, damaging innocent people in the quest to find the guilty. And while we might want to blame the police for their heavy-handed tactics, for their willingness to destroy reputations based on flimsy evidence, we also have to acknowledge the role that media played in amplifying every accusation, in treating suspicion as equivalent to guilt, in prioritizing sensational headlines over basic fairness. The newspapers of 1902 operated under different ethical standards than we expect from journalists today. There were no laws against naming suspects before they were charged. There were no privacy protections for people caught up in criminal investigations. Libel laws existed, but were difficult to enforce, especially when papers could claim they were simply reporting what police had told them. And the competition between newspapers was fierce. Every paper wanted to be first with the latest development, wanted to sell more copies than their rivals, wanted to be the one that cracked the case wide open. So they printed everything. Rumors, speculation, unverified tips from anonymous sources. They printed sketches of suspects based on vague witness descriptions. They printed theories about what might have happened even when those theories had no basis in evidence. They created a feeding frenzy that made sober investigation difficult and made innocent people into collateral damage. And the public ate it up. People wanted to know every detail of Nora Fuller's murder. They wanted to feel like they were part of the investigation, like they were helping solve the crime by reading the papers and forming their own theories and reporting suspicious behavior to police. This was entertainment for them, a real-life mystery story unfolding in their daily newspaper, complete with an innocent victim, a dastardly villain, and brave detectives working tirelessly to bring justice. But for the people actually involved, for Nora's family and the innocent men whose names were dragged through the mud and the police trying to do their jobs amid constant pressure and interference, it was anything but entertainment. It was a nightmare that seemed to have no end. Even after Charles Hadley emerged as the primary suspect, even after police narrowed their focus and stopped bringing in every random man who fit a vague description, the damage had been done. Lives had been disrupted. Reputations had been destroyed. And all of it was preserved in newspaper archives, available for anyone to find and read, ensuring that the association between these men and the Nora Fuller case would never fully disappear. This is part of why cold cases are so difficult. It's not just that evidence degrades over time, or that witnesses die, or that memories fade. It's that the initial investigation often creates so much noise, so much confusion, so many false leads and damaged lives, that sorting through it all to find the truth becomes nearly impossible. The Nora Fuller case had dozens of suspects, hundreds of interviews, thousands of pages of newspaper coverage. How do you separate what's meaningful from what's just distraction? How do you know which details matter and which are just random coincidences that got caught up in the investigative net? The police tried. They really did try. They followed every lead they could, pursued every possibility, worked long hours in an attempt to bring justice for a 15-year-old girl who'd been murdered in one of the most calculated, cold-blooded ways imaginable. But trying isn't always enough. Sometimes the truth stays hidden no matter how hard you search for it. Sometimes the guilty go free and the innocent suffer, and there's nothing anyone can do about it except acknowledge the unfairness and try to learn from it. What might we have learned from the Nora Fuller case? Perhaps that we need to be more careful about rushing to judgment. That we need to protect the privacy of people under investigation until they're actually charged with crimes. That we need to hold media accountable for the damage their coverage can cause. That we need to remember that behind every headline is a real person whose life can be destroyed by careless words and unfounded accusations. But these lessons are easy to articulate and hard to implement. Even today, more than a century later, we still see people tried and convicted in the court of public opinion long before they ever see the inside of a courtroom. We still see media organizations prioritizing speed and sensationalism over accuracy and fairness. We still see lives destroyed by accusations that turn out to be false, with no way to fully repair the damage once it's done. Nora Fuller's case wasn't just about her murder. It was about all of this. All the ways that tragedy ripples outward, affecting people who never met the victim, who had nothing to do with the crime, who were just unlucky enough to be in proximity to horror when it struck. And that makes it even harder to bear, doesn't it? Not just that Nora died, but that her death created so much additional suffering, so much collateral damage that spread far beyond the murder room on Sutter Street. Let's take a moment here. Let's breathe together. Because this is heavy, and I know you're listening in the dark, listening as you try to fall asleep, and I don't want to leave you feeling overwhelmed by the sadness of it all. Nora Fuller's story is sad. The way innocent men were treated is sad. The failure to bring her killer to justice is sad. All of it is sad. But there's also something important in remembering these stories, and not letting them disappear completely into history. Nora Fuller lived. She had hopes and dreams, and people who loved her. She was more than just a victim, more than just a cautionary tale, more than just a mystery to be puzzled over. She was a real person, and she deserves to be remembered as such. The innocent men who were accused deserved better than they got. They deserved fairness and protection and the presumption of innocence. They deserved to have their names cleared publicly with the same enthusiasm that they were smeared publicly. That didn't happen, but we can at least acknowledge that it should have. And Charles Hadley, if he was guilty, deserved to face trial for what he'd done. If he was innocent, he deserved the chance to clear his name. The fact that he disappeared, that he never faced justice one way or another, means we're left with uncertainty. And sometimes uncertainty is the hardest thing to live with. I want to return now to some of those strange, small details that littered the investigation. The clues that seemed promising at first, but led nowhere. The evidence that might have meant everything or nothing, depending on how you interpreted it. Because these details, even if they didn't solve the case, tell us something about how investigations worked in 1902, about what police considered important, about how they tried to build a narrative from fragments and possibilities. The Denver Post newspaper fragment found on the floor of the murder room seemed, initially, like it might be significant. Newspapers were traceable in ways that many other objects weren't. They were printed in specific cities, distributed in specific patterns, purchased and read by specific people. If you could figure out how a particular newspaper made its way to a particular location, you might be able to trace the person who brought it there. So police did exactly that. They contacted the Denver Post, got information about which edition had been found in the room, started tracing its distribution. They discovered it had been part of a batch sent to San Francisco, sold at specific newsstands, potentially purchased by any number of people. They narrowed it down as far as they could, following it through restaurants where newspapers were left for customers to read, through the hands of people who'd bought copies and then discarded them. And the trail ended at a restaurant. Not the popular restaurant where Nora was supposed to meet John Bennett, but a different establishment entirely. Someone associated with that restaurant had access to that particular edition of the Denver Post. But who? An employee? A customer? Someone who'd simply picked up a discarded newspaper and carried it away? The police never figured it out. The trail went cold, and the Denver Post fragment joined the pile of clues that seemed meaningful but ultimately led nowhere. But the effort that went into tracing it, the hours of work trying to follow that one small piece of evidence to its source, that tells us something about how seriously investigators took the case, how desperately they wanted to find anything that might identify Nora's killer. In our modern era of digital forensics and DNA analysis, it's easy to forget how limited investigative tools were in 1902. There were no fingerprints on file to compare, no security cameras capturing movements, no cell phone records to track locations, no DNA to collect from crime scenes. Police had to rely on much cruder methods: handwriting analysis, witness testimony, physical evidence like clothing and furniture that might or might not tell them anything useful. And newspapers. Newspapers were everywhere in 1902, serving many of the functions that digital media serves today. They were how people got information, how businesses advertised, how individuals communicated. So it made sense that police would focus on them, would try to trace them, would hope that they might provide the crucial link that solved the case. But the Denver Post fragment remained just that, a fragment, a small piece of a larger story that was never fully assembled. The same was true of the card found in Nora's purse, the one bearing the name Mr. M.A. Severbrinnick of Port Arthur. Police tracked down Severbrinnick quickly enough. He was real. He existed. He had indeed sailed to China 3 hours before Nora disappeared, which meant he couldn't possibly have been involved in her murder. He was literally on a ship in the middle of the Pacific Ocean when she died. But why did Nora have his name? The police asked Severbrinnick when he eventually returned from his voyage. He didn't know Nora Fuller, had never heard of her before her murder made the newspapers. Couldn't think of any reason why she would have a card with his name on it. One possibility was that it connected to Nora's father, who had worked in China and had died at sea. Perhaps Severbrinnick had known Nora's father, had given him a card years ago that had somehow ended up in Nora's possession. Perhaps it was a business contact, a friend, Someone who might have been able to help the Fuller family in some way. But if that was the case, why hadn't Nora's mother recognized the name? Why hadn't she mentioned any connection to Severbrinick when police showed her the card? She'd been just as puzzled as everyone else, had no explanation for why her daughter would be carrying this particular man's name. So it remained a mystery. Another small detail that might have been significant or might have been completely random. Maybe Nora had found the card somewhere. Maybe someone had given it to her for reasons that had nothing to do with anything. Maybe it was supposed to lead investigators down a false trail, planted deliberately to confuse them. We'll never know. And in some ways, that's the most frustrating thing about cold cases like this. Not the big questions about who and why, though those are frustrating enough, but the small questions about meaningless details that might not be meaningless at all, that might be the key to everything if only we could understand their significance. The cigar butt and whiskey bottle found in the murder room created their own set of questions and their own dead ends. The police tried to trace them, of course. They wanted to know what brand of cigars, what type of whiskey, where these items might have been purchased. If they could connect them to a specific person, to someone who had access to Sutter Street, it might provide the breakthrough they needed. But it was 1902. There were no barcodes, no serial numbers, no way to trace individual items back to individual purchases. The cigar butt was just a cigar, but one of thousands smoked every day in San Francisco. The whiskey bottle was just a bottle, a common brand available at dozens of shops and saloons throughout the city. Still, these items told investigators something. They suggested that the killer had spent time in that room, had been comfortable enough to drink and smoke, had been in control of the situation. This wasn't a quick, panicked murder. This was someone who felt entitled to take their time, who wasn't worried about being discovered, who perhaps even enjoyed the extended period of power and control before or after the killing. That painted a certain psychological profile. A confident killer. Someone who planned carefully and executed their plan without haste. Someone who found pleasure or satisfaction not just in the act of murder, but in the circumstances surrounding it, in the power dynamic, in the control they wielded over their victim. Modern criminal profilers might have more to say about what those details suggested. They might talk about organized versus disorganized offenders, about power reassurance versus power-assertive motivations, about whether the killer was likely to have committed similar crimes before or since. But in 1902, those concepts didn't exist yet. The police just knew they were looking for someone calm, controlled, and ruthless. Charles Hadley fit that profile in some ways. His refined appearance, his particular eating habits, his ability to maintain false identities, all suggested someone who valued control and precision. But did that make him a killer? Or did it just make him someone who liked things a certain way, who had his quirks and preferences like everyone does? The bloodstained clothes that Ollie Blasier described added weight to the case against Hadley, but they also raised questions. If he'd killed Nora Fuller, strangled her in that room on Sutter Street, would his clothes necessarily have been bloodstained? Strangulation doesn't typically produce a lot of blood. There might have been some blood from the assault, from the injuries Nora sustained, but would it have been enough to soak through clothes, to leave stains significant enough that they needed to be burned? Maybe. Or maybe the bloodstains came from something entirely different, something that had nothing to do with murder. People got nosebleeds, cut themselves shaving, had kitchen accidents. Blood on clothes wasn't inherently suspicious unless you already suspected the person of murder, unless you were already looking at everything through that lens. This is the problem with building a case on circumstantial evidence. Every piece can be interpreted in multiple ways. The false mustache could be evidence of disguise, or it could just be a theatrical prop. The bloodstained clothes could be evidence of violence, or they could be evidence of a completely innocent mishap. The handwriting match could be solid proof, or it could be a coincidence, or it could even be mistaken, a case of an expert seeing what he expected to see rather than what was actually there. Without being able to question Hadley directly, without being able to test these theories in court, without being able to cross-examine witnesses and challenge interpretations, the police were left with a case that looked strong from one angle, but fragile from another. Strong enough that they were convinced of his guilt, but not strong enough to survive the scrutiny that would come with a trial. And so the case remained open, technically unsolved even though everyone involved was fairly certain they knew who'd done it. Charles Hadley was wanted for murder, His name circulated on wanted posters, his description sent to police departments across the country. But he was never found, never arrested, never given the chance to defend himself or confess or provide any closure to the case. The Fuller family was left in limbo. Nora was buried, mourned, remembered, but her killer, whether it was Hadley or someone else entirely, remained free. And that must have been almost unbearable for her mother, knowing that the person who'd taken her daughter's life was somewhere out there, breathing and eating and sleeping and living a life that Nora would never get to live. Years passed. The investigation wound down as police moved on to other cases, as public attention shifted to other tragedies, as San Francisco continued its rapid growth and transformation. And then came 1906, and everything changed in ways no one could have predicted. The earthquake struck on the morning of April 18, 1906. It lasted less than a minute, but in that minute, San Francisco was fundamentally altered. Buildings collapsed, gas lines ruptured, fires broke out across the city, and with water mains broken by the earthquake, firefighters couldn't contain them. For 3 days, San Francisco burned, and when the fires finally died down, more than 80% of the city had been destroyed. The house at 2211 Sutter Street may have survived the initial quake or may have been damaged beyond repair. We don't know. Records from that time are incomplete, themselves damaged or destroyed by the disaster. But whether the physical building survived or not, the earthquake effectively erased much of the evidence related to Nora Fuller's murder. Files were lost. Photographs were destroyed. Physical evidence that had been carefully preserved was buried under rubble or consumed by flames. It was as if the city itself wanted to forget, wanted to move on without carrying the weight of unsolved tragedies from its past. And in the massive rebuilding effort that followed, in the determination to create a new San Francisco that would be bigger and better and more modern than before, stories like Nora Fuller's got pushed aside, became historical footnotes, became the province of true crime enthusiasts and historians rather than active investigations. But even before the earthquake, even while the investigation was still theoretically active, something else was happening. Something that tells us as much about human nature and the hunger for narrative as it does about the case itself. Thomas A. Duke, a crime writer of the era, had been following the Nora Fuller case closely, and in 1910, he published a detailed account of it, a narrative that pulled together all the various threads of the investigation, all the theories and suspects and dead ends, into a coherent story. Duke's account is fascinating because it's both incredibly detailed and almost certainly partially fictional. He had access to police reports, newspaper coverage, court records. But he also had a storyteller's instinct for making things dramatic, for filling in gaps with speculation, for creating dialogue and scenes that probably never happened exactly as he described them. His book reads like true crime, but it also reads like a novel, with all the narrative tension and dramatic beats that implies. And yet Duke's account has become, in many ways, the definitive version of the Nora Fuller story. When modern researchers look into the case, they often cite Duke because he collected so much information in one place, because he interviewed people who were still alive in 1910, but who would be dead by the time later historians came looking. His book preserved details that might otherwise have been lost forever, but it also created problems. How much of what Duke wrote actually happened? How much was embellished? How much was simply invented to make a better story? Without being able to compare his account to original sources, many of which were lost in the earthquake, it's impossible to know for certain. So the Nora Fuller case comes down to us filtered through Duke's narrative choices, through his decisions about what to include and what to leave out, through his interpretation of events that even at the time were murky and contested. This is true of many historical cases, especially ones from before modern record-keeping made it easier to preserve and access primary sources. The past comes to us mediated through stories, through accounts written by people who had their own agendas and biases and limitations. And we have to read those accounts critically, have to remember that just because something is written down doesn't make it true, doesn't mean it happened exactly that way. Duke was convinced that Charles Hadley was guilty. His narrative presents Hadley as the clear villain, the obvious suspect, the man who committed the crime. And maybe Duke was right. Maybe Hadley did do it. But Duke's certainty, his unwillingness to seriously entertain other possibilities, shaped how later generations understood the case. If you read Duke's account without questioning it, You come away thinking the case is basically solved, that we know who killed Nora Fuller even if he was never caught. But if you look at the actual evidence, if you strip away Duke's narrative framing and just examine the facts, the certainty starts to break down. You're left with handwriting analysis that might or might not be reliable, with witness testimony that's contradictory, with physical evidence that can be interpreted multiple ways, with a suspect who disappeared but who was never conclusively proven guilty of anything. It's a reminder that we should be skeptical of neat narratives, of stories that tie everything up too neatly. Real life is messier than that. Real investigations don't always end with clear answers. And real criminals sometimes get away with their crimes, not because justice failed, but because sometimes evidence just isn't there. Sometimes the breaks don't go the right way. Sometimes luck favors the guilty. Nora Fuller's mother lived until the 1920s, long enough to see San Francisco rebuilt after the earthquake, long enough to see the world change in ways that would have been unimaginable in 1902. But she never got closure. She never saw anyone arrested for her daughter's murder. She never got to sit in a courtroom and watch justice being done. She just had to live with the grief and the uncertainty, had to wake up every morning knowing that somewhere, maybe, her daughter's killer was also waking up, also going about their day, also living a life they didn't deserve. That's the real tragedy of unsolved cases. Not just the initial crime, terrible as that is, but the way the absence of resolution creates a wound that never fully heals. Families of victims carry that weight for the rest of their lives, and there's nothing anyone can do to lift it, because closure requires answers, and answers require evidence, and evidence doesn't always exist. Some cases do get solved years, or even decades later. New technology makes it possible to analyze evidence that was meaningless in its own time. Deathbed confessions provide information that was hidden for years. Random discoveries lead investigators to clues they'd missed the first time around. But the Nora Fuller case never benefited from any of those breaks. As far as we know, no one ever confessed. No new evidence ever surfaced. The case just sat there, unsolved and unsolvable, fading slowly from public consciousness until it became just another historical footnote. Except it's not just a footnote. It's a real story about a real person whose life mattered, whose death should matter, whose absence from the world left a hole that can never be filled. And even if we can't solve the case now, even if we'll never know for certain who killed Nora Fuller or why, we can still honor her memory by remembering that she existed, that she had dreams and hopes, and people who loved her. She wanted to sing. That's one of the few personal details we have about her aspirations. She loved to sing, and she dreamed of doing it professionally, of standing on a stage and making music that would touch people's hearts. She never got that chance. She was 15 years old, just beginning to figure out who she might become, and someone took that future away from her in the most brutal way imaginable. But her voice, in a sense, still echoes through history. Every time someone tells her story, every time someone reads about the Nora Fuller case and pauses to think about the human being at its center, she's being remembered. She's being honored. Her life, brief as it was, is being acknowledged as having mattered. And maybe that's all we can do with these old, unsolved cases. Maybe the best we can offer is remembrance, is the promise that we won't forget, that we won't let these stories disappear completely into the past. We can't bring Nora back. We can't give her mother the closure she deserved. We can't undo the injustice of her murder going unpunished. But we can remember. We can bear witness. We can say that Nora Fuller lived, and her life had value, and her death was a tragedy that should not be forgotten. Let's sit with that for a moment. Let's think about what it means to remember someone we never knew, someone who died more than a century ago, someone whose story comes to us filtered through newspaper accounts and police reports and true crime narratives. There's something important in that act of remembrance, something that connects us to the past in ways that matter even if we can't quite articulate why. When you listen to stories like this, when you choose to spend time learning about Nora Fuller and her unsolved murder, you're participating in a kind of memorial. You're saying that her life mattered enough to pay attention to, that her story deserves to be heard, that she shouldn't be forgotten just because she died a long time ago in a case that was never solved. And that matters. It matters to her memory, even if she can't know it. It matters to all the other victims of unsolved crimes, all the people whose stories also deserve to be told and remembered. It matters because it reminds us that behind every mystery, every cold case, every unsolved murder. There's a real person whose life was cut short, whose potential was never realized, whose absence left a permanent mark on the people who loved them. Nora Fuller was one person among millions living in San Francisco in 1902. She wasn't famous. She wasn't wealthy. She wasn't powerful. She was just a working-class girl trying to help her family, trying to build a future in a city full of opportunities and dangers. In any normal timeline, in any normal life, she might have grown up, found work she loved, maybe eventually achieved her dream of singing professionally. She might have married, had children, lived to old age surrounded by grandchildren who would never have known how close she'd come to a different fate. But that timeline was stolen from her. That future was erased. And all we're left with is the story of how she died, the mystery of who killed her, the frustration of never knowing for certain what really happened in that house on Sutter Street. It's not enough. It's never enough. But it's what we have. And so we work with it. We tell the story as carefully as we can. We honor the truth where we know it and acknowledge uncertainty where we don't. And we remember that at the center of all of this is a 15-year-old girl who deserved so much better than she got. I want to talk now about something that might seem tangential, but I think is actually central to understanding the Nora Fuller case and cases like it. I want to talk about the vulnerability of young women in 1902, about the particular dangers they faced, about the ways that society both created those dangers and failed to protect them from the consequences. Nora Fuller was far from the only young woman in San Francisco who was looking for work in January 1902. Thousands of girls her age or younger were trying to support themselves or their families, trying to find positions as domestic servants, shop girls, factory workers, nannies, any kind of employment that would bring in money without requiring the kind of education or connections they didn't have access to. And for many of them, classified advertisements were the primary way to find work. You'd read through the listings in the newspaper, find positions that seemed suitable, respond with a letter or show up in person to apply. It was how the economy worked at that level, how employers and employees found each other in an era before formal employment agencies were common, before background checks and references, and all the protections we take for granted now. But it also created opportunities for predators. Anyone could place an advertisement. There was no verification process, no requirement to prove you were who you said you were, or that the job you were advertising actually existed. You could be anyone, claim anything, lure young women to locations under false pretenses, and by the time anyone realized something was wrong, it was too late. The newspapers didn't see this as their responsibility. They were just providing a service, connecting people who wanted to hire with people who wanted to work. What happened after that initial connection, whether the job was legitimate or a trap, whether the employer was honest or a predator, that wasn't their concern. They took the money for the advertisement and printed it. And if something went wrong, well, that was unfortunate, but not their problem. This was the world Nora Fuller lived in. A world where responding to a job advertisement required a leap of faith, where meeting a potential employer meant trusting that they were who they claimed to be, where the structures that were supposed to protect young women from exploitation and violence were thin at best and non-existent at worst. Her mother knew this, of course. Every mother knew this. That's why there was uneasiness about Nora going to meet John Bennett at the popular restaurant. Not because there was any specific reason to suspect danger, but because danger was always a possibility, always lurking just beneath the surface of ordinary transactions. Every mother worried every time her daughter left the house for a job interview or a new position, worried that this might be the time something went wrong, that her daughter might not come home. Most of the time, those worries were unfounded. Most job advertisements were legitimate. Most employers were honest. Most young women went to their interviews and either got hired or didn't, and then they came home safe to try again tomorrow. But not always. Sometimes the worries were justified. Sometimes the danger was real. And when that happened, when a young woman like Nora Fuller fell into a trap, there wasn't much anyone could do to save her. The police in 1902 were not well equipped to handle these cases. They were undermanned, underfunded, often poorly trained. They operated in a legal environment that gave them broad powers but few resources. They could arrest people on suspicion, could hold them for questioning, could pressure witnesses and suspects alike. But when it came to actually solving crimes, especially crimes against women, especially crimes that required careful detective work and patient investigation, They often struggled. Part of the problem was cultural. Violence against women, particularly against working-class women, particularly against women who were seen as having put themselves in vulnerable positions, wasn't always taken as seriously as it should have been. There was a tendency to blame victims, to suggest that they'd been careless or foolish or somehow complicit in their own victimization. This didn't mean police wouldn't investigate, but it did mean they might not investigate as thoroughly, might not pursue leads as aggressively, might not care as much about getting justice. The Nora Fuller case was different in some ways because it was so sensational, so obviously calculated, so clearly a case of a young woman being lured to her death by someone who'd planned everything carefully. The newspapers made it impossible to ignore, and the public outrage made it impossible for police to just go through the motions. They had to actually try, had to actually work the case, had to actually pursue every lead. But even with that pressure, even with all the attention and resources that went into the investigation, they couldn't solve it. They couldn't protect Nora, couldn't catch her killer, couldn't provide her family with justice. And that failure, that inability to deliver what everyone wanted and needed, that tells us something about the limits of law enforcement in that era, about what could and couldn't be done even when everyone involved was trying their best. It's easy to look back from our perspective, with all our modern technology and investigative techniques, and think that if only they'd had DNA analysis or security cameras or cell phone tracking, they could have solved the case easily. And maybe that's true. Maybe with modern tools, Charles Hadley or whoever killed Nora Fuller would have been caught quickly, tried, convicted, punished. But we don't actually know that. Because even with all our modern advantages, even with all the technology and training and resources we have now, there are still unsolved murders. There are still killers who get away. There are still families waiting for answers that never come. Justice isn't a machine that automatically delivers results when you put in the right inputs. It's a human endeavor, messy and imperfect, subject to all the limitations and failings that come with being human. The people investigating Nora Fuller's murder were doing the best they could with what they had. They followed leads, they questioned suspects, they analyzed evidence, they built a case. It just wasn't enough. And sometimes trying your best still isn't enough. And that's a hard truth to accept, but it's still truth. What might have saved Nora Fuller wasn't better police work after the fact, but better protections before the fact. What if there had been regulations around classified advertisements, requirements that employers provide references or register with some kind of employment bureau? What if there had been public awareness campaigns warning young women about the dangers of meeting strangers in response to job ads? What if there had been social services available to help families like the Fullers so that Nora hadn't felt the pressure to find work at 15, hadn't been in a position where responding to questionable advertisements seemed like a necessary risk? These kinds of preventive measures wouldn't have been foolproof. Predators adapt, find new ways to access victims, exploit whatever vulnerabilities exist. But they might have made it harder, might have saved some lives even if they couldn't save all of them. And that would have been worth doing, would have been worth the effort and expense and social change required. But San Francisco in 1902 wasn't thinking in those terms. It was a city focused on growth and prosperity and progress, not on protecting its most vulnerable residents. It was a place where young women like Nora Fuller were expected to fend for themselves, to navigate dangerous situations without much support or protection, to bear the consequences if they made mistakes or encountered evil. And when something terrible happened, when a young woman was murdered by a predator who'd planned everything carefully, the city expressed outrage and demanded justice, but didn't necessarily examine the underlying conditions that had made the crime possible in the first place. The newspapers printed sensational stories, the police investigated, the public consumed it all like entertainment, and then everyone moved on to the next tragedy, the next scandal, the next story that would sell papers and capture attention. Nora Fuller's mother didn't have the luxury of moving on. She had to live with her daughter's absence every day, had to carry the weight of grief and unanswered questions for the rest of her life. And there was nothing anyone could do to ease that burden, no words of comfort that would make it better, no amount of investigation or publicity or public sympathy that would bring Nora back or make the pain go away. That's the other tragedy beyond the murder itself. The way families are left to cope with losses that should never have happened, with questions that should never have needed to be asked. The way life continues around them while they're frozen in a moment of horror, unable to fully move forward because there's no closure, no resolution, no end to the not knowing. Let me take you through some of the other theories that have been proposed over the years about what really happened to Nora Fuller. Because even though Charles Hadley remains the primary suspect in most accounts, there are people who have questioned that conclusion, who have looked at the evidence and come to different interpretations. One alternative theory suggests that Nora did indeed have a secret boyfriend, as Madge Graham indicated, and that this relationship was more serious than anyone realized. According to this theory, Nora might have been planning to elope, might have arranged the entire job advertisement scenario as a cover story so her family wouldn't question where she was going or who she was meeting. The evidence for this theory is thin but intriguing. Madge said Nora had been seeing an older man, had been secretive about the relationship. The phone call claiming Nora was at a non-existent address might have been Nora herself, trying to buy time, trying to keep her family from worrying while she went off with this man. The fact that she seemed to have gone willingly to Sutter Street, that she'd eaten and possibly drunk alcohol before her death, suggests she might have trusted the person she was with. But if this theory is true, what went wrong? Why did a romantic encounter turn deadly? Was it always meant to be deadly, with the secret boyfriend actually being a predator who'd groomed Nora over time? Or did something happen in that room? An argument or a rejection or a demand that Nora refused, that escalated into violence? The problem with this theory is that it requires us to believe Nora was much more deeply involved in planning her own disappearance than the evidence suggests. It requires us to believe she lied to her mother, created an elaborate cover story, risked everything for a relationship that she knew would be disapproved of. And while 15-year-olds in love have certainly done foolish things throughout history, there's something about this scenario that doesn't quite fit with what we know about Nora's character and circumstances. She was responsible. She was trying to help her family. She was looking for work because her family needed the money. Would someone in that position really throw it all away for a secret romance? Would she really put her family through the worry and fear of her disappearance just to run off with some man? It's possible. People do surprising things for love, and young love in particular can cloud judgment in ways that seem incomprehensible from the outside. But it's also possible that Madge misunderstood the situation, that the theater visits and hotel phone calls had a different explanation, that Nora was less deeply involved with this mysterious man than Madge believed. Another theory suggests that the whole thing was a case of wrong place, wrong time. That perhaps Nora wasn't specifically targeted at all, that the advertisement was a general trap meant to catch any young woman who responded, and Nora just happened to be the one who did. According to this theory, the killer might have been a serial predator who'd done this before in other cities, who traveled from place to place committing similar crimes, who chose San Francisco as his next hunting ground, and placed the advertisement to lure in a victim. This would explain why he disappeared so thoroughly after Nora's murder. He didn't disappear because he was Charles Hadley fleeing justice in San Francisco specifically, but because he was a transient predator moving on to his next location, his next identity, his next victim. The handwriting match to Hadley might have been coincidental, or might have been mistaken, or might have been real but irrelevant if Hadley wasn't actually the killer. The evidence for this theory is mostly the lack of evidence tying Hadley definitively to the crime. Yes, the handwriting matched, but handwriting analysis isn't infallible. Yes, he had a criminal history, but that doesn't make him a murderer. Yes, he disappeared at a suspicious time, but people disappeared for all sorts of reasons in 1902, and fleeing embezzlement charges was certainly one of them. If the real killer was someone else entirely, someone passing through San Francisco, someone who left no other traces of his presence in the city, then it would explain why the investigation hit so many dead ends. You can't catch someone who's already gone, especially in an era before nationwide criminal databases and coordinated law enforcement. A killer who moved from city to city, changing names and appearances, leaving no pattern that could be easily tracked, would be nearly impossible to catch. But this theory also requires us to believe that the handwriting match was wrong or meaningless, and that's a pretty big leap. Theodore Kitka was thorough in his analysis, examined thousands of samples, was confident in his conclusion. Dismissing that confidence entirely seems premature, even if we acknowledge that handwriting analysis has limitations. A third theory, darker and more complex, suggests that multiple people might have been involved. That perhaps the advertisement was placed by one person, the house rented by another, the actual murder committed by yet another. This kind of conspiracy theory is harder to prove or disprove because it requires imagining connections and collaborations that left no obvious evidence. But it's not impossible. Sometimes crimes do involve multiple perpetrators, each playing a specific role, each with their own motivations and vulnerabilities. If that was the case here, it would explain some of the contradictions in the evidence. Different witnesses might have seen different people, all of whom were involved in some way, but none of whom were solely responsible. The problem with conspiracy theories is that they're often used to explain away contradictions when the simpler explanation is just that evidence is messy and witnesses are unreliable and investigations are imperfect. Adding additional perpetrators doesn't necessarily make the theory more likely. It just makes it more complex and harder to verify. My own sense, looking at all the evidence, is that Charles Hadley probably was involved in Nora Fuller's murder. The handwriting evidence is strong, even if not infallible. The timing of his disappearance is suspicious. His criminal history suggests he was capable of violence. The false mustache, the blood-stained clothes, the initials on the mattress, all of it points in his direction, even if none of it constitutes absolute proof. But I also think we have to acknowledge uncertainty. We have to admit that there are gaps in the evidence, contradictions in the witness testimony, questions that were never adequately answered. We have to resist the temptation to be more certain than the evidence warrants, to create neat narratives that tie everything together when the reality is messier than that. Charles Hadley might have killed Nora Fuller. He probably did kill her. But we don't know for certain, and we never will unless some new evidence surfaces, some confession comes to light, some document is discovered that definitively answers the questions that have lingered for more than a century. And even if we could somehow prove beyond any doubt that Hadley was the killer, it wouldn't change the fundamental tragedy of the case. Nora would still be dead. Her family would still have suffered. Justice would still have failed to deliver what it should have delivered. The only difference would be that we'd have certainty instead of uncertainty. And while certainty is preferable, it's not the same as justice, not the same as making things right. Some cases can't be made right. Some wrongs can't be undone. Some families never get the closure they deserve. And that's a hard truth to sit with, but it's the truth nonetheless. The Nora Fuller case is one of those cases. Whether we know for certain who killed her or not, whether we can prove it or not, whether justice was served or not, the fundamental reality remains. A 15-year-old girl who should have had her whole life ahead of her died violently at the hands of someone who saw her as less than human, as something to be used and discarded. That's the tragedy. That's what we're left with. And no amount of investigation or theorizing or posthumous analysis can change it. Let's talk about what happened after the immediate investigation died down. After Charles Hadley's name had been plastered across every newspaper in San Francisco, and the police had done everything they could to find him. Because life doesn't stop just because a case remains unsolved. The world keeps turning, people move on, new tragedies claim public attention, and old mysteries fade into the background noise of history. For Nora Fuller's family, moving on wasn't really an option. Her mother had to continue living in a city full of memories, had to walk past places where Nora had walked, had to see other 15-year-old girls going about their lives while her daughter lay in a cemetery. She had 3 other children to raise, bills to pay, a life to somehow continue despite the gaping hole that Nora's absence had created. The police file on Nora Fuller remained open technically, but in practice, active investigation ceased after a few months. There were always new cases demanding attention, new victims needing justice, new families needing answers. Resources were limited, and when a case hit a wall the way the Fuller case did, when every lead had been exhausted and the primary suspect had vanished without a trace, it made sense to focus energy elsewhere, on cases that might actually be solvable. This is something we don't always acknowledge when we talk about cold cases. Police don't give up because they don't care or because they're lazy. They give up because they have limited resources and unlimited demands on those resources. And at some point, you have to make difficult decisions about where to invest your time and energy. A case where the suspect has disappeared and left no trail, where every lead has been followed to its conclusion with no useful result, where the evidence has been analyzed and reanalyzed without producing any breakthroughs. That's a case where further active investigation is unlikely to produce results no matter how much effort you put into it. So the Fuller case joined the ranks of the unsolved, filed away in some archive or records room, pulled out occasionally when new information came to light or when someone decided to take a fresh look, but mostly just gathering dust, becoming history rather than active investigation. And then Thomas A. Duke came along in 1910 and wrote his account, and suddenly the case was alive again, at least in the public imagination. Duke's book sold well, was read widely, became the definitive account of the Fuller murder for anyone interested in true crime or San Francisco history. In the decades that followed, as San Francisco rebuilt after the earthquake, as the city transformed from the rough and tumble gold rush town it had been into a modern metropolis, the Fuller case became a piece of local lore. Old-timers would mention it sometimes, would use it as an example of the dangers that young women faced in the old days, would invoke Nora's name as a cautionary tale or a mystery never solved. But for most people, for anyone who hadn't been directly involved or affected by the case, it was just another story, another piece of true crime entertainment to be consumed and discussed, and then forgotten. The human reality of it, the fact that Nora Fuller had been a real person with real dreams and a real family who loved her, that got lost in the retelling, buried under layers of narrative and speculation and dramatic presentation. This is something I think about a lot when I tell these stories. How do you honor the real people at the center of these cases while still acknowledging that we're telling stories, that we're creating narratives, that we're necessarily simplifying and shaping events to make them comprehensible? How do you balance the need to engage an audience with the need to respect the victims and their families? How do you avoid turning real tragedies into mere entertainment? I don't know if there are good answers to these questions. I try to be thoughtful about it, try to center the humanity of the victims, try to avoid sensationalism and cheap drama. But I'm also aware that by telling these stories at all, by presenting them as narratives with beginnings and middles and ends, even if the ends are uncertain, I'm participating in the same tradition that Duke did, the same tradition that every crime writer does, of turning real suffering into consumable content. Maybe the best we can do is be honest about that tension, acknowledge it openly rather than pretending it doesn't exist. Yes, this is a story. Yes, it's being told for an audience. Yes, there's an element of entertainment in it. But it's also a memorial, an act of remembrance, a way of ensuring that Nora Fuller and people like her aren't completely forgotten, that their stories continue to be told even if we can't give them the justice they deserved. And maybe there's value in that, in the telling and the remembering, even if it's imperfect, even if it's complicated by all these questions about ethics and exploitation and the line between honoring victims and using their stories for our own purposes. The Fuller family didn't write their own account of Nora's death. They didn't have the resources or the connections or perhaps the inclination to do so. They just had to live with what happened, had to cope with the loss and the lack of closure and the way their private tragedy had become public spectacle. And eventually, they died too. All of them. And whatever first-hand knowledge they had of Nora, whatever details they could have shared about who she really was beyond the newspaper descriptions and the police reports, that died with them. This is the tragedy of time passing. The people who really knew Nora Fuller, who could tell us what she was like when she wasn't being a cautionary tale or a mystery or a victim, those people are all gone now. All we have left are the official records, the newspaper accounts, the second-hand and third-hand descriptions filtered through investigators and journalists and crime writers, all of whom had their own agendas and limitations. We do our best to reconstruct who she was from these fragments. We note that she loved to sing, that she was trying to help her family, that she was 15 years old and full of potential that was never realized. But these are just glimpses, just scattered pieces that don't add up to a complete picture of a human being. The real Nora Fuller, in all her complexity and contradictions and ordinary humanity, is lost to us now, and all we can do is remember the outline of her story and honor what we know while acknowledging how much we don't know. I want to spend some time now thinking about the house itself, the place where Nora Fuller died, because there's something particularly haunting about locations associated with violence, about spaces where terrible things happen that then just continue to exist, continuing to be ordinary places even though they're marked by tragedy. 2211 Sutter Street was just a house. Before January 1902, it was an empty rental property, waiting for a tenant, no different from dozens of other houses in San Francisco. And after Nora's body was discovered, After the police had finished their investigation and removed all the evidence they wanted to collect, it went back to being just a house again. Someone would have rented it eventually, probably at a discount given its history, and made it their home, filled it with their own furniture and their own life and their own memories that had nothing to do with murder. Or maybe not. Maybe the house's reputation was too damaged, too tainted by association with the Fuller case. Maybe it sat empty for months or years, becoming a curiosity, a dark tourist attraction for people morbid enough to want to see where Nora died. Maybe neighborhood children dared each other to peek in the windows, to touch the walls, to prove they weren't afraid of the murder house. We don't know. The earthquake of 1906 erased so much of San Francisco's physical history that we can't say with certainty what happened to 2211 Sutter Street. It might have survived, might still exist today under a different address in a rebuilt neighborhood. Or it might have been destroyed, either by the earthquake itself or by the fires that followed or by deliberate demolition as the city rebuilt. In some ways, the ambiguity is fitting. A house that served as the stage for a mystery that was never solved. A house whose ultimate fate is itself a mystery. There's a certain poetry in that, even if it's not the kind of closure anyone would have chosen. But think about what it means to be a space where violence occurred. The walls of that back bedroom saw everything that happened to Nora Fuller. The floorboards bore her weight as she walked in. The bed held her body during and after her death. The window filtered the light that revealed her corpse when the landlord's agent raised the shade. All of these physical elements were witnesses to events that humans can only speculate about, and yet they can't speak, can't testify, can't provide the answers everyone wanted. If those walls could talk, as the saying goes, they could solve the case definitively. They could tell us who rented the house, who brought Nora there, what happened in those final hours, whether she knew her killer, whether she suffered, whether there was any moment when she might have been saved if only someone had been paying attention. But walls can't talk. Places are just places, inanimate and indifferent to the human dramas that unfold within them. The house on Sutter Street had no consciousness, no memory, no ability to bear witness to anything. It was just space and material, wood and plaster and glass, shaped into a structure that could shelter human activity, whether that activity was ordinary domestic life or premeditated murder. This is part of what makes unsolved cases so frustrating. The crime scene itself holds all the answers, at least in theory. Everything that happened somewhere, in some specific physical location with specific physical characteristics. But extracting those answers from the physical environment requires tools and techniques and knowledge that investigators in 1902 simply didn't have. Today, we might process a crime scene like that house with incredible thoroughness. We'd collect DNA from every surface, fingerprints from every object that could hold them, fibers and hair and trace evidence that could be analyzed and compared. We'd photograph everything from multiple angles, measure every dimension, create three-dimensional models that could be examined and re-examined long after the scene itself had been released. But in 1902, crime scene investigation was primitive by our standards. Police looked for obvious evidence, collected items that seemed relevant, took notes, and maybe a few photographs if they had access to the equipment. They did their best, but their best was limited by technology and training and the prevailing understanding of how to investigate crimes. So the house on Sutter Street gave up some of its secrets, but not all of them. It yielded the cigar butt and the whiskey bottle, the bedding with the CBH initials, the Denver Post fragment. It gave investigators a sense of how the scene had been staged, how deliberately the killer had prepared the space for his purpose. But it didn't give them enough to solve the case, didn't provide the definitive evidence that would have led directly to an arrest and conviction. And then it was just a house again, or became rubble in an earthquake, or continued to exist with new residents who knew or didn't know about its history, who cared or didn't care about what had happened there decades before they arrived. There's something unsettling about the idea of living in a place where someone died violently. Not because of any supernatural belief about hauntings or restless spirits, but because of the weight of history, the knowledge that this space was the last place someone alive experienced, that their final moments of terror and pain in life were bounded by these walls, contained within this room. Some people wouldn't care. History is history, the past is past, and a house is just a house regardless of what happened there. But others would feel it, would sense something heavy in the air, would be unable to forget even for a moment that someone died here, that this ordinary space was the stage for tragedy. I think about the landlord who had to re-rent the property after the investigation concluded. Did he disclose its history to prospective tenants? Did he lower the rent to compensate for the stigma? Or did he simply clean it thoroughly, remove any signs of what had occurred, and present it as any other available rental, hoping that people wouldn't ask questions or wouldn't care about the answers? These are the practical aftermath details that don't usually make it into true crime accounts. We focus on the investigation, on the victim and the suspect and the evidence and the theories. We don't spend much time thinking about what happened to the physical spaces involved after the immediate drama concluded. But those spaces continued to exist, continued to be used, continued to be part of the living city, even as they carried the memory of death. San Francisco in the early 1900s was full of such spaces. A city growing that rapidly, a city that had been through the gold rush and all the violence and chaos that came with it, accumulated tragedies the way any human settlement does. Murders happened, deaths occurred, and then life continued, and new people moved into spaces where old tragedies had unfolded, mostly unaware or deliberately ignorant of the history beneath their feet. The 1906 earthquake, in that sense, was almost a mercy. It erased so much, destroyed so much, created the opportunity for the city to rebuild itself without carrying all the weight of its violent past. Buildings associated with terrible events were demolished, land was cleared, new structures rose in places where old horrors had occurred. And while the physical memory was erased, while you could no longer point to a specific house and say, that's where it happened, the stories remained, preserved in books and newspapers and oral tradition, continuing to circulate even as the actual locations faded into uncertainty. Maybe that's better in some ways. Maybe it's healthier for a city not to carry too many visible markers of its tragedies, not to turn crime scenes into permanent memorials or dark tourist attractions. Maybe there's value in forgetting, or at least in allowing the physical landscape to forget even if the stories persist. But it also means we lose something. We lose the tangible connection to the past, the ability to stand in the actual space where events occurred and try to understand them more deeply. We lose the evidence that might have been preserved if the building still existed, might have been re-examined with modern techniques, might have yielded new insights or answers. The house on Sutter Street is gone now, in one way or another. Whether it was destroyed in the earthquake or demolished later, or simply transformed through renovation and reconstruction into something unrecognizable, the space where Nora Fuller died no longer exists in any form that would be meaningful to investigators or historians. It's become pure abstraction, a story without a physical anchor, a memory without a place to attach itself to. And maybe that's appropriate for a case that was never solved, that exists in a state of permanent uncertainty. The physical evidence has faded, the witnesses are dead, the suspect was never caught, and even the location has been erased. All we're left with is the story, passed down through accounts like Duke's, preserved in newspaper archives, retold by people like me who are trying to honor the memory of someone who died more than a century ago. It's not much, but it's what we have. And so we work with it. We tell the story. We remember that Nora Fuller existed and that her death mattered, even if the house where it happened no longer does. I want to talk about memory now, about how we remember or fail to remember, about what gets preserved and what gets lost as time passes and people die and cities transform. Because the Nora Fuller case is, in many ways, a case about memory, about how the past is reconstructed from fragments, how stories are shaped by the people who tell them, how truth becomes harder to discern the further we get from the events themselves. When Nora died in 1902, there were thousands of people who knew her story intimately. Her family, of course, but also the investigators working the case, the reporters covering it, the neighbors who followed it in the newspapers, the strangers who attended her funeral or visited the crime scene out of morbid curiosity. For all these people, Nora Fuller wasn't a historical figure or a character in a true crime narrative. She was a current event, a present tense tragedy, something happening now rather than something that happened then. Their memory of her was immediate and visceral. They could have told you what it felt like to open the newspaper and see her name, to read the gruesome details of her death, to wonder if the killer had been caught yet, to feel the mixture of fear and fascination that violent crime provokes in communities. They remembered the specifics, what the weather was like when her body was discovered, what other news was competing for attention in the papers, what their own lives were like at that moment in January and February 1902. But those people are all dead now. Every single person who had direct, immediate memory of the Nora Fuller case is gone. And with them went all the nuanced, contextual knowledge that comes from having lived through events rather than reading about them later. We can't ask them what it really felt like, can't get their unfiltered impressions, can't hear their voices telling the story in their own words. All we have are the records they left behind. Newspaper articles written by journalists who were trying to sell papers as much as inform the public. Police reports written by investigators who were trying to build a case and justify their actions. Court documents and witness testimonies shaped by legal proceedings and the desire to present information in particular ways. Thomas Duke's account, written nearly a decade after the events, already filtered through memory and narrative necessity. These are valuable sources. They preserve information that would otherwise be completely lost. But they're also limited, biased, incomplete. They show us pieces of what happened, but not the whole picture. They tell us what people thought was important to record, but not necessarily what was actually most significant. They give us the official story, the public story, the story that fit into the formats and expectations of their time. What we don't have are the private conversations, the things Nora said to her friends that never made it into witness statements, the doubts investigators had that they didn't put in their reports, the nuances of relationships and personalities that don't translate well into official documents. All of that has been lost, and we can't recover it. We can only work with what was preserved, which is always a fraction of what actually existed. This is the challenge of historical research, of trying to understand the past through the fragmented records it left behind. We do our best to reconstruct events, to understand motivations, to figure out what really happened. But we're always working with incomplete information, always filling in gaps with educated guesses, always acknowledging that our conclusions are provisional and subject to revision if new evidence emerges. And sometimes new evidence does emerge. An old letter discovered in an attic, a diary found in an estate sale, a document that was misfiled or overlooked or simply not considered important at the time. These discoveries can change our understanding of historical events, can shed new light on mysteries that seemed permanently unsolvable. But the Nora Fuller case has produced no such discoveries. No deathbed confession from Charles Hadley. No cache of letters explaining what really happened. No physical evidence that was preserved somewhere and only recently rediscovered. The case remains as mysterious now as it was in 1902, and the passage of time has only made it more difficult to solve by removing the possibility of direct testimony from anyone involved. This is what makes cold cases cold. Not just that they're old, but that they've reached a point where traditional investigative methods can't make progress anymore. The witnesses are dead, the evidence has degraded, the trail has gone completely cold. Unless something unexpected happens, unless luck intervenes in the form of a dramatic discovery, the case will remain unsolved forever. For Nora Fuller's descendants, if she has any, this must be frustrating. To know that their ancestor was murdered, that her killer was never caught, that the story has become public property rather than family history, that they can't get answers to the questions they might have. But at least her story has been preserved. At least she's remembered in some form. That's more than many victims of unsolved crimes can say. Think about all the people who died violently in 1902 whose names we don't know, whose cases weren't sensational enough to warrant newspaper coverage, whose families didn't have the resources or connections to demand investigation. Think about all the murders that went unreported or uninvestigated, all the deaths that were written off as accidents or suicides or natural causes when they were actually something darker. Think about all the victims who simply disappeared, whose bodies were never found, whose very existence has been forgotten. Nora Fuller at least exists in the historical record. Her name is known. Her story can be told. And while that's not the same as justice, while it doesn't undo what happened to her or give her family the closure they deserved, it's still significant. It means she hasn't been completely erased. It means that more than a century after her death, people are still talking about her, still wondering what happened, still trying to honor her memory by telling her story. Is that enough? Of course not. Nothing is enough when someone dies violently, and their killer goes free. But it's what we can offer now, from this distance in time. We can remember. We can tell the story. We can ensure that Nora Fuller remains more than just a statistic, more than just an unsolved case number in some dusty archive. Memory is fragile. It fades with time, distorts through repeated retelling, gets lost when the people who hold it die. But memory is also resilient. Stories persist even when the people who originally told them are gone. Names survive in records and books and accounts like this one. The past continues to exist in the present through the act of remembering, through the conscious choice to preserve and honor what might otherwise disappear completely. This is why I tell these stories. Not just for entertainment, though I hope they're engaging enough to hold your attention. Not just to satisfy curiosity about historical mysteries, though that's certainly part of it, but also to perform an act of remembrance, to ensure that people like Nora Fuller aren't forgotten, to keep their stories alive in whatever limited way I can. And when you listen to these stories, when you choose to spend your time learning about people who died long ago in circumstances that were tragic and mysterious, you're participating in that act of remembrance too. You're helping to keep the memory alive. You're honoring these victims by caring about their stories, by thinking about their lives and deaths, by refusing to let them disappear completely into the past. That might not seem like much. It doesn't solve cases or bring closure to families or deliver justice. But it matters nonetheless. Because being forgotten is another kind of death, another kind of erasure, and anything we can do to prevent that, to preserve the memory of people who suffered and died, that's worthwhile. That's meaningful. That's a small way of saying that these lives mattered, that these deaths weren't meaningless, that we still care even from this great distance in time. Let's consider for a moment what might have become of Charles Hadley if he truly was Nora Fuller's killer and managed to escape justice. Where might he have gone? What kind of life might he have lived? How might he have coped with the knowledge of what he'd done? If Hadley fled San Francisco in early 1902, he would have had numerous options for where to go. The United States was vast, much of it still sparsely settled, with plenty of places where a man could disappear and reinvent himself without attracting attention. He could have gone to another major city, blended into the crowds, found work under a new name. He could have headed to rural areas, to small towns where strangers weren't uncommon and people asked fewer questions. He could have crossed into Canada or Mexico, putting international borders between himself and American law enforcement. With a new name and a plausible story, he could have started over completely. In 1902, before widespread photography, before national identification systems, before the kind of documentation we take for granted today, it was relatively easy to claim to be someone you weren't. You could say you were John Smith from Chicago, recently arrived and looking for work, and unless someone had reason to doubt you, unless they had some way to check your story, you were John Smith from Chicago as far as anyone knew. Hadley already had experience with false identities. He'd been Charlie Start, then Charles Hadley, possibly other names in between. He knew how to present himself, how to blend in, how to maintain a facade of respectability while hiding his true nature. These skills would serve him well if he was trying to escape justice and build a new life somewhere else. But what would that new life have been like? How do you live knowing you've murdered someone, knowing you got away with it, knowing that somewhere there's a family still waiting for answers you'll never provide? Some killers feel no guilt at all. Psychopaths and sociopaths, people without empathy or conscience, can commit terrible acts and then move on without being haunted by what they've done. If Hadley was one of these people, if he truly had no moral compass, no internal voice telling him that what he'd done was wrong, then he might have lived quite comfortably with his secret. He might have integrated into some new community, built relationships, presented himself as an upstanding citizen, all while keeping the truth about Nora Fuller buried deep inside. Other killers are tormented by guilt. They might get away with their crimes legally, might never face arrest or trial or punishment, but they can't escape their own consciences. They're haunted by what they've done, plagued by nightmares and memories and the constant fear of being discovered. For these people, escaping justice doesn't mean escaping consequences. The consequences are internal, psychological, carried with them everywhere they go. We don't know which category Hadley would have fallen into, assuming he was the killer. His criminal history suggests someone comfortable with deception, comfortable breaking social rules, comfortable using other people for his own purposes. But crossing the line from fraud and assault to murder is significant. However hardened someone is, however practiced at criminality, there's a difference between property crimes and taking a human life. Maybe he was troubled by it. Maybe he had moments of remorse, of wishing he could take it back, of being overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he'd done. Maybe he tried to atone in some way, tried to live a good life afterward as some kind of compensation for the bad life he'd taken. People are complicated. It's possible to do something terrible and then genuinely try to be better, even if being better can never undo what was done. Or maybe he did it again. Maybe Nora Fuller wasn't his only victim. Maybe the careful planning, the premeditation, the ability to carry out such a calculated crime. Maybe all of that suggested someone who had killed before and would kill again. Serial killers often escalate over time, refining their methods, becoming more confident, taking greater risks. If Hadley had killed before coming to San Francisco, if Nora was one in a series rather than an isolated incident, then his disappearance might not have been the end of his crimes, but simply a geographical shift. We don't know. There's no way to know without evidence we don't have. But it's worth considering the possibilities, worth thinking about what happened to Charles Hadley after January 1902, whether he died young or lived to old age, whether he stayed in America or fled to another country, whether he ever thought about Nora Fuller or managed to compartmentalize her death completely. One possibility that has to be considered is suicide. Hadley disappeared around the time the investigation was heating up, around the time his name was starting to appear in newspapers. Maybe he realized he was about to be caught. Maybe he couldn't face arrest, trial, the public exposure of what he'd done. Maybe he decided to end things on his own terms. San Francisco had plenty of ways for someone to kill themselves discreetly in 1902. You could walk into the ocean. You could jump from one of the city's many heights. You could obtain poison from any number of sources. You could simply walk into the wilderness and disappear, letting exposure and dehydration do the work. If Hadley chose this path, his body might never have been found, or might have been found but not identified, especially if it was badly decomposed or damaged. This would explain why he vanished so completely, why no subsequent sightings or reports ever surfaced. Dead men don't turn up in other cities. They don't make mistakes that reveal their identities. They simply cease to exist, leaving behind only the mystery of their disappearance. But it's also possible he just got lucky. Luck plays a bigger role in criminal justice than we like to admit. Some killers get caught because they make mistakes, because evidence is preserved, because witnesses come forward, because investigators are thorough and persistent. But other killers get away because luck falls in their favor, because evidence is lost, because witnesses don't see anything useful, because investigators are overwhelmed with other cases or simply don't have the resources to pursue every lead. If Hadley got lucky, if he made it out of San Francisco without being caught, if he successfully established a new identity somewhere else, and then was just careful enough to avoid drawing attention to himself, he could have lived out his life in freedom. He could have died of natural causes decades later, taking his secrets to the grave, never facing justice for what he'd done to Nora Fuller. That's a hard thought to sit with. The idea that someone could commit such a calculated murder and then simply get away with it. Live a normal life, maybe even a happy life. Die peacefully in bed surrounded by people who never knew what he'd done. It violates our sense of justice, our belief that the guilty should be punished, that somehow the universe should balance the scales even if human institutions fail to do so. But the universe doesn't work that way. Justice isn't automatic. Bad people sometimes prosper while good people suffer. Killers sometimes escape while victims remain dead. That's the reality we live in, uncomfortable as it is. And if Hadley did get away, if he lived out his life without facing consequences, then Nora Fuller's murder was never avenged. Her family never got closure. The justice system failed in its fundamental purpose. And somewhere, a man who took a 15-year-old girl's life got to keep living his own, untroubled by the law even if troubled by his conscience. These are the possibilities we have to consider when looking at an unsolved case. Not just the investigative angles, not just the evidence and suspects and theories, but also the human reality of what might have happened afterward, the lives that continued or didn't continue, the fates that unfolded in the shadows beyond what the official record can tell us. We'll never know for certain what became of Charles Hadley. We'll never know if he was truly guilty or wrongly suspected. We'll never know if he lived or died. if he killed again or never killed at all, if he was haunted by Nora Fuller or forgot about her completely. All we can do is acknowledge the uncertainty, sit with the discomfort of not knowing, and accept that some questions don't have answers no matter how badly we want them. I want to spend some time now thinking about what the Nora Fuller case tells us about the American justice system in the early 1900s, about what's changed and what hasn't in the century plus since her murder. Because while the specific details of the case are unique, the patterns it reveals are all too familiar. The vulnerability of young women to violence, particularly young women who were working class, who didn't have the protection of wealth or social connections or families with power and influence. That vulnerability hasn't disappeared. Women are still targeted, still victimized, still blamed when they fall prey to predators. We've made progress in some areas, yes. We have better laws, better resources for victims, more awareness of the dynamics of gendered violence. But the fundamental reality that being young and female and economically disadvantaged makes you more vulnerable to harm, that reality persists. The problem of classified advertisements and anonymous communication being used to lure victims. In 1902, it was newspaper ads. Today, it's online platforms, dating apps, social media. The technology changes, but the tactic remains the same. Create a scenario where someone feels safe meeting a stranger. Use anonymity to hide your true intentions. Exploit the gap between presentation and reality to trap your victim. We've developed better verification systems, better safety protocols, better ways of tracking and tracing online communication. But we haven't eliminated the problem, haven't made it impossible for predators to use modern communication tools the way Hadley used a simple newspaper advertisement. The media's role in sensationalizing crime and potentially interfering with investigations. This is perhaps even worse now than it was in 1902. At least then, newspapers had to wait for morning editions to print the latest developments. Now, with 24/7 news cycles and social media, information and misinformation spread instantly. Trial by media happens faster and more thoroughly than ever before. Innocent people's lives are destroyed by accusation before any investigation can determine facts. The problems that plagued the Fuller investigation, the way innocent men were publicly identified and vilified, that happens constantly in our current media environment. The limitations of forensic science and investigative techniques. We've made enormous progress here. DNA analysis has revolutionized crime solving. Digital forensics can track movements and communications in ways that would have seemed like magic in 1902. Databases allow for comparison and matching across jurisdictions. And yet, cases still go unsolved. Evidence is still ambiguous. Witnesses are still unreliable. Technology has given us better tools, but it hasn't made investigation foolproof. We still make mistakes, still reach wrong conclusions, still let guilty people go free while innocent people get convicted. The disparity in how cases are investigated based on who the victim is. Nora Fuller got massive media attention, intensive police investigation, public outcry demanding justice. Why? Partly because her case was particularly egregious, carefully planned and executed in a way that captured public imagination. But also because she was white, because she was young, because she fit a particular narrative of innocent victimhood that resonated with the public and the media. Other murders in San Francisco in 1902 received far less attention. Other victims, particularly if they were not white, if they were immigrants, if they were sex workers or otherwise marginalized, their deaths might have warranted a brief newspaper mention and a cursory investigation. This disparity, often called missing white woman syndrome, continues today. We know which victims get media coverage, get sustained investigation, get public sympathy. And we know which victims are ignored, forgotten, treated as somehow less deserving of justice. This isn't about diminishing what happened to Nora Fuller. Her death was tragic. She deserved justice. Her family deserved answers. But it's worth acknowledging that the attention her case received wasn't available to all victims, that the justice system has never been equally invested in solving all crimes, that some lives have always been treated as more valuable than others. And finally, there's the question of closure and what happens when cases remain unsolved. The Fuller family never got answers. They never got to see Nora's killer brought to justice. They had to live with uncertainty, with the knowledge that somewhere the person who'd murdered their daughter was walking free. And that uncertainty, that lack of closure, it affected them for the rest of their lives. We see this pattern repeated in every unsolved case. Families left in limbo, unable to fully process their grief because there's no resolution, no endpoint, no sense that justice was done. Some families channel their pain into activism, into pushing for changes in laws or investigative practices. Others withdraw, unable to bear the constant reminders of what they've lost. And all of them carry a weight that most of us can't imagine, the weight of unanswered questions and unresolved tragedy. The Fuller case also shows us the importance of preserving evidence and maintaining good records. So much was lost in the 1906 earthquake. Files destroyed, physical evidence gone, the ability to re-examine the case with fresh eyes or new technology eliminated. Today we have better systems for preserving case files, for digitizing records, for ensuring that information isn't lost to disaster or simple neglect. But preservation isn't perfect. Records still get lost. Evidence still degrades. Digital files can be corrupted or erased. The passage of time still erodes our ability to understand and solve historical cases. There's a lesson here about the fragility of justice, about how much depends on accident and chance, and the specific circumstances of investigation. A case that might have been solved with slightly different evidence, slightly better preservation of the crime scene, slightly more thorough investigation, instead becomes permanently unsolvable because those conditions weren't met. And once a certain amount of time passes, once witnesses die and evidence degrades beyond recovery, the window for solving the case closes permanently. This is why cold case units exist, why investigators periodically re-examine old files, why new techniques are applied to old evidence. Because even decades later, there's sometimes a chance to find answers that weren't available before. DNA can be extracted from evidence that predates DNA analysis. Digital enhancement can reveal details in old photographs that weren't visible to the naked eye. Witnesses who were children during the original investigation might remember something significant as adults. But these victories are rare. Most cold cases remain cold. Most unsolved murders stay unsolved. The Nora Fuller case is more typical than exceptional in this regard. For every case that gets solved decades later through new technology or a lucky break, there are dozens that never get resolved, that just fade further and further into history until no one remembers them anymore except as footnotes in books about unsolved crimes. What should we take from all this? What lessons does the Nora Fuller case teach us about justice, about memory, about the way societies handle violence and loss? Perhaps the most important lesson is humility. Humility about the limitations of our justice system, about what it can and cannot deliver. Humility about our ability to understand the past, to reconstruct events from fragments and partial records. Humility about the certainty of our conclusions when we're working with incomplete evidence and unreliable testimony. We want cases to be solved. We want bad people to be punished. We want families to get closure. But wanting these things doesn't make them happen. Sometimes, despite everyone's best efforts, justice fails. Sometimes killers escape. Sometimes families never get answers. And we have to live with that reality, uncomfortable as it is. We can work to improve the system, to make justice more reliable and more equitable. We can develop better investigative techniques, better support for victims' families, better protocols for preserving evidence and maintaining records. We can push for reforms that address the disparities in who gets investigated thoroughly and who doesn't. We can demand better from our media, better from our police, better from ourselves as citizens who consume and shape the narratives around crime and punishment. But we also have to accept that even with all possible improvements, some cases will remain unsolved. Some questions will never be answered. Some families will never get the closure they deserve. That's not a reason to give up or stop trying. It's just a reality we need to acknowledge. The Nora Fuller case remains unsolved after more than a century. Charles Hadley was never caught. The evidence was never conclusive enough to definitively prove anyone's guilt. The investigation, thorough as it was for its time, couldn't overcome the limitations of early 20th century forensic science. And now, with all the principles dead and most of the physical evidence lost, the case will almost certainly never be solved. But Nora Fuller is remembered. Her story is still told. Whether that person was Charles Hadley or someone else, whether they ever faced any consequences for what they did, we don't know. But we know that Nora Fuller didn't deserve what happened to her. She deserved to live. She deserved to pursue her dream of singing. She deserved to grow up and have experiences and build a life and become whoever she might have become. All of that was stolen from her. And that theft, that fundamental injustice, can't be undone by investigation or theorizing or storytelling. Nothing can give her back the life that was taken. Nothing can compensate her mother for the daughter she lost. Nothing can make it right. But we can remember. We can tell her story. We can ensure that her name and her existence aren't completely erased by time. And maybe that counts for something. Maybe bearing witness, maintaining memory, refusing to forget. Maybe these things have value even if they can't deliver justice. I've spent a long time with you tonight, walking through the details of this case, examining the evidence, considering the theories, thinking about what it all means. And if you're still listening, if you've stayed with me through this whole long journey, thank you. Thank you for caring enough about a 15-year-old girl who died more than a century ago to spend your time learning about her story. Thank you for being part of the act of remembrance that keeps her from being forgotten completely. As you drift off to sleep now, as you let this story fade into your dreams, I hope you'll spare a thought for Nora Fuller. Not just for how she died, but for how she lived. Not just for the mystery of her murder, but for the reality of her existence. She was here. She mattered. She deserves to be remembered. And maybe, somewhere in whatever comes after, she knows that people are still thinking about her, still honoring her memory, still refusing to let her story disappear into the silence of history. Maybe that brings some small measure of peace to a life that ended too soon and too violently. Rest now, my sleepy friends. Let the weight of this story settle gently over you. Let the rain continue its soft rhythm in the background. Let yourself drift into sleep knowing that you've done something worthwhile tonight. You've remembered. You've honored. You've borne witness to a life that mattered. Sleep well. And if you're still awake, drop a comment below letting me know where you're from and what time you're watching. Share this story if you think others should know about Nora Fuller. Like and subscribe so you can hear more stories like this one. Stories of people who deserve to be remembered even if their cases were never solved. Good night. Rest peacefully. And remember Nora Fuller, the girl who wanted to sing, whose voice was silenced too soon, but whose story continues to echo through time, carried forward by people like you who choose to listen, to care, to remember. Thank you for being here. Until next time, this is Mr. Midnight True Crime Stories, signing off. Sleep well, my friends. You've honored someone tonight just by listening. That matters more than you know.